Hello everyone, and welcome to the 265th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Saruman from the Tolkien Legendarium. If you're a fan of my videos, consider signing up to become a patron of the channel over on Patreon. As with the changes YouTube has made to their platform lately, the channel is in a rather precarious position, so consider supporting it if you're able to by clicking the card on your screen or the link in the description, and receive a whole bunch of perks in the process. Now, while there are a few more villains from the Legendarium I'd still like to cover, there was no doubt in my mind that the next one had to be Saruman, one of the main villains of this universe and a minor Dark Lord in his own right. As you might have noticed, this video is quite long, and that might be a surprise for some of you who have only seen the films, or even if you've only read The Lord of the Rings. But much like Sauron, there is a lot of information about Saruman that can be found in the various writings of J.R.R. Tolkien that never quite made it into The Lord of the Rings. Specifically for Saruman, what his son Christopher compiled about him in Unfinished Tales. Though there's also some information we can find about him in the Silmarillion, as well as the nature of Middle-earth, that we'll be talking about as well. So, just like with the Sauron video, the majority of this video will consist of me reading for you much of the information about Saruman you can find in the books he appears in. As though the films do an excellent job at adapting his character, like any character from literature, there's so much more that can be said about them due to the nature of the medium. And because the author knows their character better than we ever could, I always feel that it's best to use the detailed information they give us about them in order to enhance our understanding of the character, as well as their morality. So that's what we're going to do here as I share with you my analysis of his character. However, if you're a Tolkien superfan who knows Middle-earth and everything to do with it like the back of your hand, I have included timestamps that will allow you to skip through any information you don't need or want to hear again. But if you haven't, you'll be learning a whole lot more than you likely knew about Saruman before watching this video and the fantastic story that he appears in. But speaking of fantastic stories, I have something very special to share with all of you today, and that's this beautiful book I have right here, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. This is exactly what it sounds like, but also so much more, as it's not just a history or science book, but a unique concept that you'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere else, let alone of such high quality. Within, you'll find all manner of tips and secrets geared towards providing you with all the knowledge you might need to rebuild civilization, or even help you in so many ways in your daily life, while civilization is still thriving as well. But as I said, it's more than just an encyclopedia. It's a story in and of itself, one that relays to you all the things that have made it possible for me to be speaking to you in this video. And it doesn't just tell that story with words, but with beautiful and captivating illustrations that brings everything said between these pages to life. The thing is though, it's not just a book, it's an experience. One that I didn't expect to have such complexity and depth when I first opened it, as interwoven between all these wonderful descriptions and images is a quest with so many layers to it that people are still discovering more to this day. Because in truth, it's not a book, it's a rabbit hole. On your first read, you might notice little symbols here and there that pique your interest, and upon leafing through it again, you'll notice more in the connections between them. But then, those connections will lead you to more, and more after that, and on as you become more and more engrossed with the vast stores of knowledge right at your fingertips. This book encourages you to think bigger, to consider all that we are, all that we've done, and all that we could be. And so it's no mystery why How to Rebuild a Civilization raised more than $2.3 million on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and why over 50 professionals came together to make this mystifying tome a reality. And if you want access to a genuine must-have for any curious mind, consider clicking the link down in the description to check out more details about this wonderful book and to start your journey towards acquiring greater understanding of all things human. And be sure to enter the code I, that's EYE at checkout, to get 10% off your purchase. But with all that being said, I believe it's time we get into the video proper. So without further ado, let's begin. As with the Dark Lords Morgoth and Sauron, the story of Saruman began long ago at the very beginning of time itself. Like Morgoth and Sauron, Saruman was an Ainur, specifically a Maiar, a member of the race of angelic beings that were second only to the Valar in stature, with Eru Ilúvatar being supreme above all. Before coming to Middle-earth, Saruman was known by the name Kurumo, and he dwelt in the blessed realm of Valinor alongside his brethren. But not too much is known of Saruman during his residency in Valinor, aside from this information. In the section of the book Nature of Middle-earth titled Key Dates, we're given mention of 5 guardians being sent to Cuiviénen once the elves awoke to guard them, those 5 being the Maiar who would later become the Istari, or the wizards we know so well, with Saruman at the time being referred to by the name Tarindor. Other than that though, the deeds of Saruman prior to his selection to journey to Middle-earth along with the other 4 wizards are largely unknown. In The Lord of the Rings, the only history we're given for Saruman and the rest of the wizards is found in Appendix B, where it states, when maybe 1,000 years had passed and the first shadow had fallen on Greenwood the Great, the Istari, or wizards, appeared in Middle-earth. It was afterwards said that they came out of the far west and were messengers sent to contest the power of Sauron and to unite all those who had the will to resist him, but they were forbidden to match his power with power or to seek to dominate elves or men by force and fear. They came therefore in the shape of men, though they were never young and aged only slowly, and they had many powers of mind and hand. They revealed their true names to few, but used such names as were given to them. The two highest of this order, of whom it is said there were 5, were called by the Eldar Curanir, the man of skill, and Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, but by men in the north, Saruman and Gandalf. Curanir journeyed often into the east, but dwelt at last in Isengard. Mithrandir was closest in friendship with the Eldar, and wandered mostly in the west, and never made for himself any lasting abode. But if we take a look at some excerpts from unfinished tales from the chapter titled the Istari, we learn a bit more about the selection process surrounding the Istari's mission to Middle-earth, their arrival in early years there, and Saruman's stature amongst the Maiar. And though this first excerpt appears after the one that follows it, considering it has to do with the formation of the Istari, I thought it best we take a look at this one first. Here, Christopher Tolkien writes, "Most of the remaining writings about the Istari, as a group, are unhappily no more than very rapid jottings, often illegible. Of major interest, however, is a brief and very hasty sketch of a narrative, telling of a council of the Valar, summoned it seems by Manwë, and maybe he called upon Eru for counsel, at which it was resolved to send out 3 emissaries to Middle-earth. Who would go? For they must be mighty, peers of Sauron, but must forego might, and clothe themselves in flesh, so as to treat on equality and win the trust of elves and men. But this would imperil them, dimming their wisdom and knowledge, and confusing them with fears, cares, and weariness coming from the flesh. But 2 only came forward, Curumo, who was chosen by Aule, and Alatar, who was sent by Orome. Then Manwë asked, where was Olorin? And Olorin, who was clad in grey, and having just entered from a journey had seated himself at the edge of the council, asked what Manwë would have of him. Manwë replied that he wished Olorin to go as the 3rd messenger to Middle-earth, and it is remarked in parentheses that Olorin was a lover of the Eldar that remained, apparently to explain Manwë's choice. But Olorin declared that he was too weak for such a task, and that he feared Sauron. Then Manwë said that that was all the more reason why he should go, and that he commanded Olorin. Illegible words follow that seem to contain the word 3rd. But at that, Varda looked up and said, not as the 3rd, and Curumo remembered it. The note ends with a statement that Curumo, Saruman, took Iwendil, Radagast, because Yavanna begged him, and that Alatar took Palando as a friend. On another page of jottings clearly belonging to the same period, it is said that Curumo was obliged to take Iwendil to please Yavanna, wife of Aule. There are here also some rough tables relating the names of the Istari to the names of the Valar. Olorin to Manwë and Varda, Curumo to Aule, Iwendil to Yavanna, Alatar to Orome, and Palando also to Orome, but this replaces Palando to Mandos and Nienna. The meaning of these relations between Istari and Valar is clearly, in the light of the brief narrative just cited, that each Istar was chosen by each Vala for his innate characteristics, perhaps even that they were members of the people of that Vala, in the same sense as is said of Sauron in the Valaquenta that, in his beginning, he was of the Maiar of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. It is thus very notable that Curumo, Saruman, was chosen by Aule. The next few lines of text from this excerpt detail the discrepancy between this jotting and text established in the essay on the Istari, which I'll read for you in a moment, and of the Rings of Power in the Silmarillion that state that Saruman came alone, not with Radagast, as this explanation would suggest. And considering this contradicts other materials, we're going to assume that Saruman did indeed come first to Middle-earth, and did so alone, but you'll hear that soon enough as I read for you now this essay. The Istari. Wizard is a translation of the Quenya Istar, Sindarin Ithron, one of the members of an order, as they called it, claiming to possess and exhibiting eminent knowledge of the history and nature of the world. The translation, though suitable in its relation to wise and other ancient words of knowing, similar to that of Istar and Quenya, is not perhaps happy, since the Heron Istarion, or Order of Wizards, was quite distinct from the wizards and magicians of later legend. They belonged solely to the Third Age, and then departed, and none save maybe Elrond, Círdan, and Galadriel discovered of what kind they were, or whence they came. Among men they were supposed, at first, by those that had dealings with them to be men who had acquired lore and arts by long and secret study. They first appeared in Middle-earth about the year 1000 of the Third Age, but for long they went about in simple guise, as it were of men already old in years, but hale in body, travelers and wanderers, gaining knowledge of Middle-earth and all that dwelt therein, but revealing to none their powers and purposes. In that time, men saw them seldom and heeded them little, but as the shadow of Sauron began to grow and take shape again, they became more active and sought ever to contest the growth of the shadow and to move elves and men to beware of their peril. Then far and wide rumor of their comings and goings and their meddling in many matters was noised among men, and men perceived that they did not die, but remained the same, unless it were that they aged somewhat in looks, while the fathers and sons of men passed away. Men, therefore, grew to fear them, even when they loved them, and they were held to be one of the elven race, with whom, indeed, they often consorted. Yet they were not so, for they came from over the sea out of the uttermost west, though this was for long known only to Círdan, guardian of the Third Ring, master of the Grey Havens, who saw their landings upon the western shores. Emissaries they were from the lords of the west, the Valar, who still took counsel for the governance of Middle-earth, and when the shadow of Sauron began first to stir again took this means of resisting him. For with the consent of Eru, they sent members of their own high order, but clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain, though because of their noble spirits, they did not die, and aged only by the cares and labors of many long years. And this the Valar did, desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. Of this order the number is unknown, but of those that came to the north of Middle-earth, where there was the most hope, because of the remnant of the Dunedain and of the Eldar that abode there, the chiefs were 5. The first to come was one of noble mien and bearing, with raven hair and a fair voice, and he was clad in white. Great skill he had in works of hand, and he was regarded by well nigh all, even by the Eldar, as the head of the order. Others there were also, 2 clad in sea blue, and 1 in earthen brown, and last came one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, grey-haired, and grey-clad, and leaning on a staff. But Círdan from their first meeting at the Grey Havens divined in him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and he welcomed him with reverence, and he gave to his keeping the third ring, Narya the Red. "For," said he, "great labors and perils lie before you, and lest your task prove too great and wearisome, take this ring for your aid and comfort. It was entrusted to me only to keep secret, and here upon the west shores it is idle, but I deem that in days ere long to come it should be in nobler hands than mine, that may wield it for the kindling of all hearts to courage." And the grey messenger took the ring, and kept it ever secret. Yet the white messenger, who was skilled to uncover all secrets, after a time became aware of this gift, and begrudged it, and it was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore to the grey, which afterwards became manifest. Now the white messenger in later days became known among elves as Curinir, the man of craft, in the tongues of northern men Saruman, but that was after he returned from his many journeys, and came into the realm of Gondor, and there abode. Of the blue little was known in the west, and they had no name save Ithrin Luin, the blue wizards, for they passed into the east with Curinir, but they never returned, and whether they remained in the east, pursuing there the purposes for which they were sent, or perished, or as some hold were ensnared by Sauron and became his servants, is not now known. But none of these chances were impossible to be, for, strange indeed though this may seem, the Istari, being clad in bodies of Middle-earth, might even as men and elves fall away from their purposes, and do evil, forgetting the good in the search for power to effect it. For it is said indeed that being embodied the Istari had need to learn much anew by slow experience, and though they knew whence they came, the memory of the blessed realm was to them a vision from afar off, for which, so long as they remained true to their mission, they yearned exceedingly. Thus by enduring of free will the pangs of exile and the deceits of Sauron, they might redress the evils of that time. Indeed, of all the Istari, one only remained faithful, and he was the last comer, for Radagast, the fourth, became enamored of the many beasts and birds that dwelt in Middle-earth, and forsook elves and men, and spent his days among the wild creatures. Thus he got his name, which is in the tongue of Númenor of old, and signifies, it is said, tender of beasts. And Curinir Lan, Saruman the White, fell from his high errand, and becoming proud and impatient and enamored of power, sought to have his own will by force, and to oust Sauron, but he was ensnared by that dark spirit, mightier than he. But the last comer was named among the elves Mithrandir, for he dwelt in no place, and gathered to himself neither wealth nor followers, but ever went to and fro in the Westlands from Gondor to Angmar, and from Lindon to Lorien, befriending all folk in times of need. Warm and eager was his spirit, and it was enhanced by the ring Narya, for he was the enemy of Sauron, opposing the fire that devours and wastes with the fire that kindles and succors in wanhope and distress. But his joy and his swift wrath were veiled in garments gray as ash, so that only those that knew him well glimpsed the flame that was within. Merry he could be, and kindly to the young and simple, and yet quick at times to sharp speech and the rebuking of folly. But he was not proud, and sought neither power nor praise, and thus far and wide he was beloved among all those that were not themselves proud. Mostly he journeyed unwearingly on foot, leaning on a staff, and so he was called among men of the north Gandalf, the elf of the wand, for they deemed him, though in error, as has been said, to be of elven kind, since he would at times work wonders among them, loving especially the beauty of fire, and yet such marvels he wrought mostly for mirth and delight, and desired not that any should hold him in awe, or take his counsels out of fear. Elsewhere it is told how it was that when Sauron rose again, he also arose and partly revealed his power, and becoming the chief mover of the resistance to Sauron was at last victorious, and brought all by vigilance and labor to that end which the Valar under the one that is above them had designed. Yet it is said that in the ending of the task for which he came, he suffered greatly, and was slain, and being sent back from death for a brief while was clothed then in white, and became a radiant flame, yet veiled still, save in great need. And when all was over, and the shadow of Sauron was removed, he departed forever over the sea, whereas Curinir was cast down, and utterly humbled, and perished at last by the hand of an oppressed slave, and his spirit went whithersoever it was doomed to go, and to Middle-earth, whether naked or embodied, came never back. The essay on the Istari just cited thus tells much about them and their origin that does not appear in The Lord of the Rings, and also contains some incidental remarks of great interest about the Valar, their continuing concern for Middle-earth, and their recognition of ancient error, which cannot be discussed here. Most notable are the description of the Istari as members of their own high order, the Order of the Valar, and the statements about their physical embodiment. But also to be remarked are the coming of the Istari to Middle-earth at different times, Círdan's perception that Gandalf was the greatest of them, Saruman's knowledge that Gandalf possessed the Red Ring, and his jealousy, the view taken of Radagast, that he did not remain faithful to his mission, the two other blue wizards, unnamed, who passed with Saruman into the east, but unlike him never returned into the Westlands, the number of the Order of the Istari, said here to be unknown, though the chiefs of those that came to the north of Middle-earth were 5, the explanation of the names Gandalf and Radagast, and the Sindarin word Ithron, plural Ithrin. The passage concerning the Istari and of the Rings of Power in the Silmarillion is very close indeed to the statement in Appendix B to The Lord of the Rings cited above, even in wording, but it does include this sentence, agreeing with the essay on the Istari. Curinir was the eldest, and came first, and after him came Mithrandir, and Radagast, and others of the Istari, who went into the east of Middle-earth, and do not come into these tales. Indeed, the information provided here aids us mightily in understanding the character of Saruman further, and how the seeds of his downfall were present within him from the very beginning. There are a few things in particular to note here, but one of the most important bits of information we're given is the fact that Saruman, like Sauron, was once a Maiar of Aule. This is not only significant because they were, in a sense, siblings that shared a deeper connection to one another than to their other brethren, but because of Aule's nature and his status amongst the Valar. Of the fabric of earth had Aule thought, to whom Ilúvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor. But the delight and pride of Aule is in the deed of making, and in the thing made, and neither in possession, nor in his mastery, wherefore he gives, and hoards not, and is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. Aule has might little less than Ulmo. His lordship is over all the substances of which Arda is made. In the beginning he wrought much in fellowship with Manwë and Ulmo, and the fashioning of all lands was his labor. He is a smith, and a master of all crafts, and he delights in works of skill, however small, as much as in the mighty building of old. His are the gems that lie deep in the earth, and the gold that is fair in the hand, no less than the walls of the mountains and the basins of the sea. The Noldor learned most of him, and he was ever their friend. Melkor was jealous of him, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers, and there was long strife between them, in which Melkor ever marred or undid the works of Aule, and Aule grew weary in repairing the tumults and disorders of Melkor. Both, also, desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill. But Aule remained faithful to Eru and submitted all that he did to his will, and he did not envy the works of others, but sought and gave counsel. Whereas Melkor spent his spirit in envy and hate, until at last he could make nothing save in mockery of the thought of others, and all their works he destroyed if he could. These are excerpts from the Silmarillion, and in learning that Aule is much like Morgoth in many ways, we find the perfect explanation for why it was so easy for Sauron to first align himself to Morgoth, and for Saruman to seek to align himself with, or usurp his scion. It shouldn't be said that all Maya of Aule were predisposed to evil, as that would be erroneous, but rather that it's reasonable to assume that they're more susceptible to the allure of power and control than other members of their species might be, due to the similarities they innately share with their patron, and his brother who was so alike him in thought and desire. But aside from this, as Christopher Tolkien noted in Unfinished Tales, another aspect of Saruman's character that doubtlessly contributed to his downfall was his status as an important, powerful, and wise man amongst the Maiar. So much so that Aule put forth his name when it came time to decide who the Valar should send to Middle-earth to aid in the fight against Sauron. Perhaps Aule believed that one of his own was best suited to combat someone who was once aligned with himself, but regardless of how Aule felt about him, the rest of the Valar clearly saw within Saruman a great power as well, as not only was he included in this mission, but he became the head of the Istari. It's that very position and stature though that would ultimately aid in corrupting his person, as Saruman, as is often the case with those who are afforded great admiration and respect, or who believe themselves to be deserving of it, was prone to jealousy and envy whenever he wasn't afforded the attention or prestige that he believed he deserved, as is the case with his relationship with Gandalf, or when he felt he was not as powerful as he could be or should be, like with Sauron, who was, until his very end, far greater in power than Saruman could have ever hoped to be, without first claiming some of his power for his own. Furthermore, it should be noted that the mortal coil he was bound to for the duration of his errand, and the effect it had on his mind and body, contributed heavily to his fall from grace. As we learned, though the Istari knew where they came from, that knowledge was mostly a distant memory for them upon their arrival. And for Saruman, knowing where he came from, but having his form ensure that knowledge was so easy to place in the recesses of his mind, likely caused him to think as the years went on, much like Sauron did, that the Valar, though they were concerned with Middle-earth, were not so concerned that someone like himself could not still make a name for himself and claim some of the power, glory, and prestige of his overlords and their enemies. Also, with his mind more mortal than it was divine, and thus subject to mortal desires and faults, it was made all too easy for him to entertain the allure of evil, an idea which a footnote in Unfinished Tales supports that states the following. An unplaced marginal note observes that Saruman's integrity had been undermined by purely personal pride and lust for the domination of his own will. His study of the rings had caused this, for his pride believed that he could use them, or it, in defiance of any other will. He, having lost any devotion to other persons or causes, was open to the domination of a superior will, to its threats, and to its display of power. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. As though there is much to be said about Saruman and his fall, we should first retrace the steps that led to that fall, for it was not until many centuries had passed after his arrival that he fell to evil. As we learned, when Saruman first arrived in Middle-earth in the year 1000 of the Third Age, he went into the east with the Blue Wizards, returning to the west after nearly 1500 years had passed without them, and settling in the realm of Gondor after he had concluded his journeys there and elsewhere. From nearly the very beginning of their arrival in Middle-earth, the wise had sensed a shadow forming in what would soon become known as Mirkwood, in the stronghold of Dol Guldur, but suspected then that it was only one of the Nazgul, and not their master. It wouldn't be until the year 2060 that they began to suspect it was Sauron himself who had made it his abode, and 3 years later, Gandalf entered Dol Guldur to investigate, which caused Sauron to flee to the east, ushering in an era known as the Watchful Peace. Nearly 400 years passed before Sauron once again made Dol Guldur his home in 2460, and it was 3 years later, shortly after Saruman's return in the year 2463, that the White Council was formed, and Saruman made its leader. But at length the shadow returned, and its power increased, and in that time was first made the Council of the Wise, that is called the White Council, and therein were Elrond, and Galadriel, and Círdan, and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir, and Curanir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place, nor be subject to any summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the Rings of Power, their making, and their history. Here, upon his return, and at the head of the wise, Saruman found himself in a prestigious role that surely satisfied his ever-growing ego. But as a man hungry for knowledge, a return to the West did not mean an end to his studies, especially into the making of the Rings of Power and the fate of the One. So for a long while, he dwelt in Gondor, walking amongst men as he would, and forging alliances with the great lines of the kings of that land, as well as those of Rohan, among other individuals both respected and unsavory. And as he studied, his lust for power grew ever larger. Over 300 years following the formation of the White Council in the year 2759, Saruman's relationship with the kings of the Mark would pay off greatly when he was awarded the keys to the Tower Orthanc, centerpiece of the great ring fortress of Isengard, making this his home thereafter. And from another excerpt from Unfinished Tales, we learn more about the history that led to his residency there. In ancient days, the southern and eastern bounds of the North Kingdom had been the Grey Flood. The western bounds of the South Kingdom was the Isen. To the land between, the Enedwaith, or Middle Region, few Númenóreans had ever come, and none had settled there. In the days of the kings, it was part of the realm of Gondor, but it was of little concern to them, except for the patrolling and upkeep of the Great Royal Road. This went all the way from Osgiliath and Minas Tirith to Fornost in the far north, crossed the fords of Isen, and passed through Enedwaith, keeping to the higher land in the center and northeast until it had to descend to the westlands about the lower Grey Flood, which it crossed on a raised causeway leading to a great bridge at Tharbad. In those days, the region was little peopled. In the marshlands of the mouths of Grey Flood and Isen lived a few tribes of wild men, fishers and fowlers, but akin in race and speech to the Druidine of the woods of Anórien. In the foothills of the western side of the Misty Mountains lived the remnants of the people that the Rohirrim later called the Dunlendings, a sullen folk, akin to the ancient inhabitants of the White Mountain valleys whom Isildur cursed. They had little love of Gondor, but though hardy and bold enough, were too few and too much in awe of the might of the kings to trouble them, or to turn their eyes away from the east, whence all their chief perils came. The Dunlendings suffered, like all the peoples of Arnor and Gondor, in the Great Plague of the years 1636 through 7 of the Third Age, but less than most, since they dwelt apart and had few dealings with other men. When the days of the kings ended, 1975 to 2050, and the waning of Gondor began, they ceased in fact to be subjects of Gondor. The royal road was unkept in Enedwaith, and the bridge of Tharbad becoming ruinous was replaced only by a dangerous ford. The bounds of Gondor were the Isen and the Gap of Calanarthon, as it was then called. The gap was watched by the fortress of Aglarond, the Hornburg, and Angrenost, Isengard, and the fords of Isen, the only easy entrance to Gondor, were ever guarded against any incursion from the Wildlands. But during the watchful peace, from 2063 to 2460, the people of Calanarthon dwindled. The more vigorous, year by year, went eastward to hold the line of the Anduin. Those that remained became rustic and far removed from the concerns of Minas Tirith. The garrisons of the forts were not renewed, and were left to the care of local hereditary chieftains whose subjects were of more and more mixed blood, for the Dunlendings drifted steadily and unchecked over the Isen. Thus it was, when the attacks on Gondor from the east were renewed, and orcs and easterlings overran Calanarthon and besieged the forts, which would not have long held out. Then the Rohirrim came, and after the victory of Errol on the field of Celebrant in the year 2510, his numerous and warlike people with great wealth of horses swept into Calanarthon, driving out or destroying the eastern invaders. Cirion the Steward gave them possession of Calanarthon, which was thenceforth called the Riddermark, or in Gondor, Rothand, later Rohan. The Rohirrim at once began the settlement of this region, though during the reign of Errol, their eastern bounds along the Aemon Mule and Anduin were still under attack. But under Brego and Aldor, the Dunlendings were rooted out again and driven away beyond the Isen, and the fords of Isen were guarded. Thus the Rohirrim earned the hatred of the Dunlendings, which was not appeased until the return of the king, then far off in the future. Whenever the Rohirrim were weak or in trouble, the Dunlendings renewed their attacks. No alliance of peoples was ever more faithfully kept on both sides than the alliance of Gondor and Rohan under the oath of Cirion and Errol, nor were any guardians of the wide grassy plains of Rohan more suited to their land than the riders of the Mark. Nonetheless, there was a grave weakness in their situation, as was most clearly shown in the days of the War of the Ring, when it came near to causing the ruin of Rohan and of Gondor. This was due to many things. Above all, the eyes of Gondor had ever been eastward, whence all their perils came. The enmity of the wild Dunlendings seemed of small account to the stewards. Another point was that the stewards retained under their own rule the Tower of Orthanc and the Ring of Isengard. The keys of Orthanc were taken to Minas Tirith. The tower was shut, and the Ring of Isengard remained manned only by a hereditary Gondorian chieftain and his small people, to whom were joined the old hereditary guards of Aglarond. The fortress there was repaired with the aid of masons of Gondor, and then committed to the Rohirrim. From it the guards of the fords were supplied. For the most part, their settled dwellings were about the feet of the White Mountains, and in the glens and valleys of the south. To the northern bounds of the Westfold, they went seldom, and only at need, regarding the eaves of Fangorn, the Entwood, and the frowning walls of Isengard with dread. They meddled little with the Lord of Isengard and his secret folk, whom they believed to be dealers in dark magic. And to Isengard the emissaries from Minas Tirith came ever more seldom, until they ceased. It seemed that amidst their cares, the stewards had forgotten the tower, though they held the keys. Yet the western frontier and the line of the Isen was naturally commanded by Isengard, and this had evidently been well understood by the kings of Gondor. The Isen flowed down from its sources along the eastern wall of the ring, and as it went on southwards it was still a young river that offered no great obstacle to invaders, though its waters were still very swift and strangely cold. But the great gate of Angrenost opened west of Isen, and if the fortress were well manned, enemies from the Westlands must be in great strength if they thought to pass on into Westfold. Moreover, Angrenost was less than half the distance of Aglarond from the fords, to which a wide horse road ran from the gates, for most of the way over level ground. The dread that haunted the great tower, and fear of the glooms of Fangorn that lay behind, might protect it for a while, but if it were unmanned and neglected, as it was in the later days of the stewards, that protection would not long avail. In the reign of King Daor, 2699 to 2718, the Rohirrim found that to keep a watch on the fords was not enough. Since neither Rohan nor Gondor gave heed to this far corner of the realm, it was not known until later what had happened there. The line of the Gondorian chieftains of Angrenost had failed, and the command of the fortress passed into the hands of a family of the people. These, as has been said, were already long before of mixed blood, and they were now more friendly disposed to the Dunlendings than to the wild Northmen who had usurped the land. With Minas Tirith far away, they no longer had any concern. After the death of King Aldor, who had driven out the last of the Dunlendings, and even raided their lands in Enedwaith by way of reprisal, the Dunlendings, unmarked by Rohan, but with the connivance of Isengard, began to filter into northern Westfold again, making settlements in the mountain glens west and east of Isengard, and even in the southern eaves of Fangorn. In the reign of Daor, they became openly hostile, raiding the herds and studs of the Rohirrim in Westfold. It was soon clear to the Rohirrim that these raiders had not crossed the Isen either by the fords or at any point far south of Isengard, for the fords were guarded. Daor therefore led an expedition northwards, and was met by a host of Dunlendings. These he overcame, but he was dismayed to find that Isengard was also hostile. Thinking that he had relieved Isengard of a Dunlendish siege, he sent messengers to its gates with words of goodwill, but the gates were shut upon them, and the only answer they got was by bowshot. As was later known, the Dunlendings, having been admitted as friends, had seized the ring of Isengard, slaying the few survivors of its ancient guards who were not, as were most, willing to merge with the Dunlendish folk. Daor sent word at once to the steward in Minas Tirith, at that time, in the year 2710, Egelmoth, but he was unable to send help, and the Dunlendings remained in occupation of Isengard until, reduced by the Great Famine after the Long Winter, 2758 to 2759, they were starved out and capitulated to Frealaf, afterwards first king of the Second Line. But Daor had no power to storm or besiege Isengard, and for many years the Rohirrim had to keep a strong force of riders in the north of Westfold. This was maintained until the great invasions of 2758. It can thus be readily understood that when Saruman offered to take command of Isengard and repair it and reorder it as part of the defenses of the West, he was welcomed by both King Frealaf and by Beren the Steward. So when Saruman took up his abode in Isengard, and Beren gave to him the keys of Orthanc, the Rohirrim returned to their policy of guarding the fords of Isen as the most vulnerable point in their western frontier. There can be little doubt that Saruman made his offer in good faith, or at least with goodwill towards the defense of the West, so long as he himself remained the chief person in that defense and the head of its council. He was wise, and perceived clearly that Isengard with its position and its great strength natural and by craft, was of utmost importance. The line of the Isen, between the pincers of Isengard and the Hornburg, was a bulwark against invasion from the east, whether incited and guided by Sauron or otherwise, either aiming at encircling Gondor or at invading Eriador. But in the end, he turned to evil and became an enemy, and yet the Rohirrim, though they had warnings of his growing malice towards them, continued to put their main strength in the west of the fords, until Saruman, in open war, showed them that the fords were small protection without Isengard, and still less against it. Now after he was granted the keys to Orthanc, Saruman continued to play the role of ally to both the Council and the men of the West while studying further the Rings of Power and the whereabouts of the One, with only Gandalf suspecting that his heart may have turned elsewhere, as he continually witnessed Saruman's efforts to thwart the Council's attempts to waylay Sauron whenever his shadow rose over the land, which occurred at nearly every meeting of the White Council, something that we learn from these excerpts from the Silmarillion and the appendix of Lord of the Rings. Now the shadow grew ever greater, and the hearts of Elrond and Mithrandir darkened. Therefore on a time, Mithrandir at great peril went again to Dol Guldur and the pits of the sorcerer, and he discovered the truth of his fears, and escaped. And returning to Elrond he said, "True, alas, is our guess. This is not one of the Ulairi, as many have long supposed. It is Sauron himself who has taken shape again, and now grows apace. And he is gathering again all the rings to his hand, and he seeks ever for news of the One and of the heirs of Isildur, if they live still on earth." And Elrond answered, "In the hour that Isildur took the ring and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought, that Sauron should return. Yet the One was lost," said Mithrandir, "and while it still lies hid, we can master the enemy if we gather our strength and tarry not too long." Then the White Council was summoned, and Mithrandir urged them to swift deeds, but Curanir spoke against him and counseled them to wait yet and to watch. "For I believe not," said he, "that the One will ever be found again in Middle-earth. Into Anduin it fell, and long ago, I deem, it was rolled to the sea. There it shall lie until the end, when all this world is broken and the deeps are removed." Therefore naught was done at that time, though Elrond's heart misgave him, and he said to Mithrandir, "Nonetheless I forebode that the One will yet be found, and then war will arise again, and in that war, this age will be ended. Indeed, in a second darkness it will end, unless some strange chance deliver us that my eyes cannot see. Many are the strange chances of the world," said Mithrandir, "and help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter." Thus the wise were troubled, but none as yet perceived that Curanir had turned to dark thoughts and was already a traitor in heart. For he desired that he and no other should find the great ring, so that he might wield it himself and order all the world to his will. Too long he had studied the ways of Sauron and hoped to defeat him, and now he envied him as a rival rather than hated his works. And he deemed that the ring, which was Sauron's, would seek for its master as he became manifest once more. But if he were driven out again, then it would lie hid. Therefore he was willing to play with peril and let Sauron be for a time, hoping by his craft to forestall both his friends and the enemy when the ring should appear. He set a watch upon the Gladden fields, but soon, in the year 2939, he discovered that the servants of Dol Guldur were searching all the ways of the river in that region. Then he perceived that Sauron also had learned of the manner of Isildur's end, and he grew afraid and withdrew to Isengard and fortified it, and ever he probed deeper into the lore of the Rings of Power and the art of their forging. But he spoke of none of this to the council, hoping still that he might be the first to hear news of the ring. He gathered a great host of spies, and many of these were birds, for Radagast lent him his aid, divining naught of his treachery, and deeming that this was but part of the watch upon the enemy. But ever the shadow in Mirkwood grew deeper, and to Dol Guldur evil things repaired out of all the dark places of the world, and they were united again under one will, and their malice was directed against the elves and the survivors of Numenor. Therefore at last, in 2941, the council was again summoned, and the lore of the rings was much debated. But Mithrandir spoke to the council, saying, "It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7, he has recovered 3. We must strike." To this Curanir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river Gladden, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time, he aided the council, and they put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood for a brief while was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, for the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all his movements, and the Ulairi, His 9 servants had gone before him to make ready for his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned, and ere the wise could prevent him, he re-entered his kingdom in Mordor and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. And in that year, 2953, the White Council met for the last time, and Curanir withdrew to Isengard and took counsel with none save himself. Entries in the Lord of the Rings appendix expands upon this information a bit. Saruman withdraws to Isengard, which he takes as his own, and fortifies it. Being jealous and afraid of Gandalf, he sets spies to watch all his movements, and notes his interest in the Shire. He soon begins to keep agents in Bree and the South Farthing. Finally, it would be in the year 3000 that Saruman's fall became complete, and his heart forevermore turned against his enemies, as it was here in this year that Saruman dared to use the Palantir of Orthanc, but became ensnared by Sauron, who had the Ithil Stone. He becomes a traitor to the Council, and his spies report that the Shire is being closely guarded by the Rangers. Saruman would not again enter into this tale until his capture of Gandalf some 18 years later, and his open declaration of support for Sauron. But before we move on to discuss that part of his story, let's delve into what made it possible for Sauron to come so far without nearly anyone suspecting his intentions, and expand upon the aspects that contributed to his fall that we discussed earlier. As we already noted, Saruman was an exceptionally powerful Maya, but there was no greater talent he held than that of his commanding voice. The window closed. They waited. Suddenly another voice spoke, low and melodious, its very sound an enchantment. Those who listened unwarily to that voice could seldom report the words that they heard, and if they did, they wondered, for little power remained in them. Mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that it said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. When others spoke, they seemed harsh and uncouth by contrast, and if they gainsaid the voice, anger was kindled in the hearts of those under the spell. For some, the spell lasted only while the voice spoke to them, and when it spoke to another, they smiled, as men do who see through a juggler's trick, while others gape at it. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled, but for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved. None rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. This is a description of Saruman's voice that were given after his defeat following the Battle of Helm's Deep. And in this description, we're shown just how mighty this voice of his was, for even here, in defeat, all who heard him were enamored. Elves, men, hobbits, dwarves, all save the returned Gandalf himself. With that in mind, it only makes sense that this power, along with his stature amongst the wise, allowed Saruman to manipulate even the White Council in any way that he wished. But it wasn't just his voice and his stature that allowed Saruman to operate as he would, but a great intellect and knowledge of all manner of things both having to do with the Rings of Power and otherwise. A mind of metal and wheels that did not care for growing things, except as far as they served him for the moment. And with his physical appearance being what it was, something that was brought to life in a way no other man could by the late great Sir Christopher Lee, he was a force to be reckoned with, appearing as a man wizened, tall, and strong. A man whose honeyed speech, piercing eyes, and boundless knowledge made even kings bow before him. A man who, after falling to evil, became fearsome and terrifying in his wrath. It's true that this being, a spirit of great power, was driven to evil due to a fixation with power, a megalomania that he may have been in some way predisposed to that saw him bringing ruin to countless innocent lives, as well as his own. But as we touched on earlier, it was also jealousy and envy that drove Saruman into the arms of evil, something that's exemplified for us in another excerpt from Unfinished Tales. Saruman soon became jealous of Gandalf, and this rivalry turned at last to a hatred, the deeper for being concealed, and the more bitter in that Saruman knew in his heart that the Grey Wanderer had the greater strength and the greater influence upon the dwellers in Middle-earth, even though he hid his power and desired neither fear nor reverence. Saruman did not revere him, but he grew to fear him, being ever uncertain how much Gandalf perceived of his inner mind, troubled more by his silences than by his words. So it was that openly he treated Gandalf with less respect than did others of the wise, and was ever ready to gainsay him or to make little of his counsels, while secretly he noted and pondered all that he said, setting a watch, so far as he was able, upon all his movements. It was in this way that Saruman came to give thought to the halflings and the Shire, which otherwise he would have deemed beneath his notice. He had at first no thought that the interest of his rival in this people had any connection with the great concerns of the council, least of all with the Rings of Power. For indeed in the beginning, it had no such connection, and was due only to Gandalf's love for the little people, unless his heart had some deep premonition beyond his waking thought. For many years he visited the Shire openly and would speak of its people to any who would listen, and Saruman would smile, as at the idle tales of an old land rover, but he took heed nonetheless. Seeing then that Gandalf thought the Shire worth visiting, Saruman himself visited it, but disguised and in the utmost secrecy, until he had explored and noted all its ways and lands, and thought then he had learned all that there was to know of it. And even when it seemed to him no longer wise nor profitable to go thither, he still had spies and servants that went in or kept an eye upon its borders, for he was still suspicious. He was himself so far fallen that he believed all others of the council had each their deep and far-reaching policies for their own enhancement, to which all that they did must in some way refer. So when long after he learned something of the finding of Gollum's ring by the halfling, he could believe only that Gandalf had known of this all the time, and this was his greatest grievance, since all that concerned the rings he deemed his especial province. That Gandalf's mistrust of him was merited and just in no way lessened his anger. Yet in truth, Saruman's spying in great secrecy had not in the beginning any evil purpose, but was no more than a folly born of pride. Small matters, unworthy it would seem to be reported, may yet prove of great moment ere the end. Now truth to tell, observing Gandalf's love of the herb that he called pipeweed, for which he said, if for nothing else, the little people should be honored, Saruman had affected to scoff at it, but in private he made trial of it, and soon began to use it, and for this reason the Shire remained important to him. Yet he dreaded lest this should be discovered, and his own mockery turned against him, so that he would be laughed at for imitating Gandalf, and scorned for doing so by stealth. This then was the reason for his great secrecy in all his dealings with the Shire, even from the first before any shadow of doubt had fallen upon it, and it was little guarded, free for those who wished to enter. For this reason also, Saruman ceased to go thither in person, for it came to his knowledge that he had not been all unobserved by the keen-eyed halflings, and some, seeing the figure as it were of an old man clad in grey or russet stealing through the woods or passing through the dusk, had mistaken him for Gandalf. After that Saruman went no more to the Shire, fearing that such tales might spread and come maybe to the ears of Gandalf. But Gandalf knew of these visits and guessed their object, and he laughed, thinking this the most harmless of Saruman's secrets. But he said nothing to others, for it was never his wish that anyone should be put to shame. Nonetheless, he was not ill-pleased when the visits of Saruman ceased, doubting him already, though he could not himself yet foresee that a time would come when Saruman's knowledge of the Shire would prove perilous and of the greatest service to the enemy, bringing victory to within a nail's breadth of his grasp. In another version, there is a description of the occasion when Saruman openly scoffed at Gandalf's use of the pipeweed. Now because of his dislike and fear, in the later days, Saruman avoided Gandalf, and they seldom met, except at the assemblies of the White Council. It was at the Great Council held in 2851 that the Halfling's Leaf was first spoken of, and the matter was noted with amusement at the time, though it was afterwards remembered in a different light. The council met in Rivendell, and Gandalf sat apart, silent, but smoking prodigiously, a thing he had never done before on such an occasion, while Saruman spoke against him and urged that contrary to Gandalf's advice, Dol Guldur should not yet be assaulted. Both the silence and the smoke seemed greatly to annoy Saruman, and before the council dispersed, he said to Gandalf, "When weighty matters are in debate, Mithrandir, I wonder a little that you should play with your toys of fire and smoke, while others are in earnest speech." But Gandalf laughed and replied, "You would not wonder if you used this herb yourself. You might find that smoke blown out cleared your mind of shadows within. Anyway, it gives patience to listen to error without anger. But it is not one of my toys. It is an art of the little people away in the west, merry and worthy folk, though not of much account, perhaps, in your high policies." Saruman was little appeased by this answer, for he hated mockery, however gentle, and he said then coldly, "You jest, Lord Mithrandir, as is your way. I know well enough that you have become a curious explorer of the small, weeds, wild things, and childish folk. Your time is your own to spend, if you have nothing worthier to do, and your friends you may make as you please. But to me, the days are too dark for wanderers' tales, and I have no time for the simples of peasants." Gandalf did not laugh again, and he did not answer, but looking keenly at Saruman, he drew on his pipe and sent out a great ring of smoke with many smaller rings that followed it. Then he put up his hand, as if to grasp them, and they vanished. With that he got up and left Saruman without another word, but Saruman stood for some time silent, and his face was dark with doubt and displeasure. This story appears in half a dozen different manuscripts, and in one of them, it is said that Saruman was suspicious, doubting whether he read rightly the purport of Gandalf's gesture with the rings of smoke. Above all, whether it showed any connection between the halflings and the great matter of the rings of power, unlikely though that might seem. and doubting that one so great could concern himself with such a people as the halflings for their own sake merely. In another, Struck Through, Gandalf's purpose is made explicit. It was a strange chance that, being angered by his insolence, Gandalf chose this way of showing to Saruman his suspicion that desire to possess them had begun to enter into his policies and his study of the lore of the rings, and of warning him that they would elude him. For it cannot be doubted that Gandalf had as yet no thought that the halflings, and still less their smoking, had any connection with the rings. If he had any such thought, then certainly he would not have done then what he did. Yet later, when the halflings did indeed become involved in this greatest matter, Saruman could believe only that Gandalf had known or foreknown this, and had concealed the knowledge from him and from the council, for just such a purpose as Saruman would conceive, to gain possession and to forestall him. In the Tale of Years, the entry for 2851 refers to the meeting of the White Council in that year, when Gandalf urged an attack on Dol Guldur, but was overruled by Saruman, and a footnote to the entry reads, "It afterwards became clear that Saruman had then begun to desire to possess the One Ring himself, and hoped that it might reveal itself, seeking its master, if Sauron were let be for a time." The foregoing story shows that Gandalf himself suspected Saruman of this at the time of the Council of 2851, though my father afterwards commented that it appears from Gandalf's story to the Council of Elrond of his meeting with Radagast that he did not seriously suspect Saruman of treachery or of desiring the ring for himself until he was imprisoned in Orthanc. Envy and jealousy. Jealousy and envy. Poisons that steadily turned Saruman away from his friends and all that was good in this world until only a lustful, prideful, power-hungry man remained, one who was cunning and devious who, even after being instilled with great fear by the entity he wished to usurp, endeavored mightily to gain for himself greater power so he might one day rule all before him. His first real attempt at accomplishing this feat was his revelation to Gandalf of his treachery and his imprisonment of him within Orthanc. In the films, this event, and Saruman's revelation of his intent here, differs in scope from what we discussed so far about his character as it pertains to the novel. Here, Saruman declares that Sauron cannot be defeated, and thus it is more wise to join him instead, and he attempts to convince Gandalf to do so, but fails. The difference here is Saruman's stated fealty to Sauron, and only fealty, as we're never given any indication in this version of the story that he desires the ring for himself, aside from his mentioned alerts that the hobbits were carrying something of great importance, and he wanted them brought back to him alive. In the novel, and in the information we receive about him in other tales, Saruman wavers constantly, depending on his position, as to whether or not he should attempt to join Sauron as his chief lieutenant, or usurp him if possible. So while much of what we've discussed so far regarding Saruman's origins and intentions still applies in many ways to the film version of him, he's decidedly less concerned with the ring and gaining it for himself than he is in the novel, and many of these differences are plain to see in the account Gandalf gives to the Council at Rivendell of his time as a prisoner in Orthanc. At the end of June, I was in the Shire, but a cloud of anxiety was on my mind, and I rode to the southern borders of the little land, for I had a foreboding of some danger, still hidden from me, but drawing near. There messages reached me telling of war and defeat in Gondor, and when I heard of the Black Shadow, a chill smote my heart. But I found nothing save a few fugitives from the south, yet it seemed to me that on them sat a fear of which they would not speak. I turned then east and north and journeyed along the Greenway, and not far from Bree, I came upon a traveler sitting on a bank beside the road with his grazing horse beside him. It was Radagast the Brown, who at one time dwelt at Roscoble, near the borders of Mirkwood. He is one of my order, but I had not seen him for many a year. "Gandalf," he cried, "I was seeking you, but I am a stranger in these parts. All I knew was that you might be found in a wild region with the uncouth name of Shire." "Your information was correct," I said, "but do not put it that way if you meet any of the inhabitants. You are near the borders of the Shire now, and what do you want with me? It must be pressing. You are never a traveler unless driven by great need." "I have an urgent errand," he said. "My news is evil." Then he looked about him as if the hedges might have ears. "Nazgul," he whispered. "The Nine are abroad again. They have crossed the river secretly and are moving westward. They have taken the guise of riders in black." I knew then what I had dreaded without knowing it. "The enemy must have some great need or purpose," said Radagast, "but what it is that makes him look to these distant and desolate parts, I cannot guess." "What do you mean?" said I. "I have been told that wherever they go, the riders ask for news of a land called Shire." "The Shire," I said, but my heart sank. For even the wise might fear to withstand the Nine when they are gathered together under their fell chieftain. A great king and sorcerer he was of old, and now he wields a deadly fear. "Who told you, and who sent you?" I asked. "Saruman the White," answered Radagast, "and he told me to say that if you feel the need, he will help." but you must seek his aid at once, or it will be too late." And that message brought me hope, for Saruman the White is the greatest of my order. Radagast is, of course, a worthy wizard, a master of shapes and changes of hue, and he has much lore of herbs and beasts, and birds are especially his friends. But Saruman has long studied the arts of the enemy himself, and thus we have often been able to forestall him. It was by the devices of Saruman that we drove him from Dol Guldur. It might be that he had found some weapons that would drive back the Nine. "I will go to Saruman," I said. "Then you must go now," said Radagast, "for I have wasted time in looking for you, and the days are running short. I was told to find you before midsummer, and that is now here. Even if you set out from this spot, you will hardly reach him before the Nine discover the land that they seek. I myself shall turn back at once." And with that he mounted, and would have ridden straight off. "Stay a moment," I said. "We shall need your help, and the help of all things that will give it. Send out messages to all the beasts and birds that are your friends. Tell them to bring news of anything that bears on this matter to Saruman and Gandalf. Let messages be sent to Orthanc." "I will do that," he said, and rode off as if the Nine were after him. I could not follow him then and there. I had ridden very far already that day, and I was as weary as my horse, and I needed to consider matters. I stayed the night in Bree, and decided that I had no time to return to the Shire. Never did I make a greater mistake. However, I wrote a message to Frodo, and trusted to my friend the innkeeper to send it to him. I rode away at dawn, and I came at long last to the dwelling of Saruman. That is far south in Isengard, in the end of the Misty Mountains, not far from the Gap of Rohan. And Boromir will tell you that this is a great open vale that lies between the Misty Mountains and the northern foothills of Ered Nimrai. But Isengard is a circle of sheer rocks that enclose a valley as with a wall, and in the midst of that valley is a tower of stone called Orthanc. It was not made by Saruman, but by the men of Numenor long ago, and it is very tall and has many secrets, yet it looks not to be a work of craft. It cannot be reached save by passing the circles of Isengard, and in that circle there is only one gate. Late one evening I came to the gate, like a great arch in the wall of rock, and it was strongly guarded. But the keepers of the gate were on the watch for me, and told me that Saruman awaited me. I rode under the arch, and the gate closed silently behind me, and suddenly I was afraid, though I knew no reason for it. But I rode to the foot of Orthanc, and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. He wore a ring on his finger. "So you have come, Gandalf," he said to me gravely, but in his eyes there seemed to be a white light, as if a cold laughter was in his heart. "Yes, I have come," I said. "I have come for your aid, Saruman the White," and that title seemed to anger him. "Have you indeed, Gandalf the Grey?" he scoffed. "For aid? It has seldom been heard of that Gandalf the Grey sought for aid, one so cunning and so wise, wandering about the lands and concerning himself in every business, whether it belongs to him or not." I looked at him and wondered. "But if I am not deceived," said I, "things are now moving which will require the union of all our strength." "That may be so," he said, "but the thought is late in coming to you. How long, I wonder, have you concealed from me, the head of the council, a matter of greatest import? What brings you now from your lurking place in the Shire?" "The Nine have come forth again," I answered. "They have crossed the river, so Radagast said to me." "Radagast the Brown," laughed Saruman, and he no longer concealed his scorn. "Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him. For you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colors." I looked then and saw that his robes, which had seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colors, and if he moved, they shimmered and changed hue so that the eye was bewildered. I liked white better, I said. "White," he sneered. "It serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed, the white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken. In which case, it is no longer white," said I, "and he that breaks a thing to find out what it is, has left the path of wisdom." "You need not speak to me as to one of the fools that you take for friends," said he. "I have not brought you hither to be instructed by you, but to give you a choice." He drew himself up then, and began to declaim, as if he were making a speech long rehearsed. "The elder days are gone, the middle days are passing, the younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men, which we must rule. But we must have power, power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. And listen, Gandalf, my old friend and helper," he said, coming near and speaking now in a softer voice. I said we, for we it may be, if you will join with me. A new power is rising. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Knowledge, rule, order. All the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There need not be, there would not be, any real changes in our designs, only in our means. Saruman, I said, I have heard speeches of this kind before, but only in the mouths of emissaries sent from Mordor to deceive the ignorant. I cannot think that you brought me so far, only to weary my ears. He looked at me sidelong, and paused a while considering. Well, I see that this wise course does not commend itself to you, he said. Not yet, not if some better way can be contrived. He came and laid his long hand on my arm. And why not, Gandalf? He whispered. Why not? The ruling ring, if we could command that, then the power would pass to us. That is in truth why I brought you here, for I have many eyes in my service, and I believe that you know where this precious thing now lies. Is it not so? Or why do the Nine ask for the Shire, and what is your business there? As he said this, a lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes. Saruman, I said, standing away from him, only one hand at a time can wield the one, and you know that well, so do not trouble to say we. But I would not give it. Nay, I would not give even news of it to you, now that I learn your mind. You were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. Have you others to offer? He was cold now, and perilous. Yes, he said, I did not expect you to show wisdom, even in your own behalf, but I gave you the chance of aiding me willingly, and so saving yourself much trouble and pain. The third choice is to stay here until the end. Until what end? Until you reveal to me where the one may be found. I may find means to persuade you, or until it is found in your despite, and the ruler is time to turn to lighter matters, to devise, say, a fitting reward for the hindrance and insolence of Gandalf the Grey. That may not prove to be one of the lighter matters, said I. He laughed at me, for my words were empty, and he knew it. They took me and they set me alone on the pinnacle of Orthanc, in the place where Saruman was accustomed to watch the stars. There is no descent save by a narrow stair of many thousand steps, and the valley below seems far away. I looked on it and saw that, whereas it had once been green and fair, it was now filled with pits and forges. Wolves and orcs were housed in Isengard, for Saruman was mustering a great force on his own account, in rivalry of Sauron, and not in his service. Yet, over all his works a dark smoke hung and wrapped itself about the sides of Orthanc. I stood alone on an island in the clouds, and I had no chance of escape, and my days were bitter. I was pierced with cold, and I had but little room in which to pace to and fro, brooding on the coming of the riders to the north. That the Nine had indeed arisen I felt assured, apart from the words of Saruman, which might be lies. Long ere I came to Isengard I had heard tidings by the way that could not be mistaken. Fear was ever in my heart for my friends in the Shire, but still I had some hope. I hoped that Frodo had set forth at once, as my letter had urged, and that he had reached Rivendell before the deadly pursuit began, and both my fear and my hope proved ill-founded, for my hope was founded on a fat man in Bree, and my fear was founded on the cunning of Sauron. But fat men who sell ale have many calls to answer, and the power of Sauron is still less than fear makes it. But in the circles of Isengard, trapped and alone, it was not easy to think that the hunters before whom all had fled, or fallen, would falter in the Shire far away. I saw you, cried Frodo. You were walking backwards and forwards. The moon shone in your hair. Gandalf paused astonished and looked at him. It was only a dream, said Frodo, but it suddenly came back to me. I had quite forgotten it. It came some time ago, after I left the Shire, I think. Then it was late in coming, said Gandalf, as you will see. I was in an evil plight, and those who know me will agree that I have seldom been in such need, and do not bear such misfortune well. Gandalf the Grey caught like a fly in a spider's treacherous web. yet even the most subtle spiders may leave a weak thread. At first I feared, as Saruman no doubt intended, that Radagast had also fallen, yet I had caught no hint of anything wrong in his voice or in his eye at our meeting. If I had, I should never have gone to Isengard, or I should have gone more warily. So Saruman guessed, and he had concealed his mind and deceived his messenger. It would have been useless in any case to try and win over the honest Radagast to treachery. He sought me in good faith, and so persuaded me. That was the undoing of Saruman's plot, for Radagast knew no reason why he should not do as I asked, and he rode away towards Mirkwood where he had many friends of old, and the eagles of the mountains went far and wide, and they saw many things, the gathering of wolves and the mustering of orcs, and the 9 riders going hither and thither in the lands, and they heard news of the escape of Gollum, and they sent a messenger to bring these tidings to me. So it was that when summer waned, there came a night of moon, and Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, swiftest of the great eagles, came unlooked for to Orthanc, and he found me standing on the pinnacle. Then I spoke to him, and he bore me away before Saruman was aware. I was far from Isengard, ere the wolves and orcs issued from the gate to pursue me. "How far can you bear me?" I said to Gwaihir. "Many leagues," said he, "but not to the ends of the earth. I was sent to bear tidings, not burdens." "Then I must have a steed on land," I said, "and a steed surpassingly swift, for I have never had such need of haste before." "Then I will bear you to Edoras, where the Lord of Rohan sits in his halls," he said, "for that is not very far off." And I was glad, for in the Rittermark of Rohan, the Rohirrim, the horse lords dwell, and there are no horses like those that are bred in that great vale between the misty mountains and the white. "Are the men of Rohan still to be trusted, do you think?" I said to Gwaihir, for the treason of Saruman had shaken my faith. "They pay a tribute of horses," he answered, "and send many yearly to Mordor, or so it is said, but they are not yet under the yoke. But if Saruman has become evil, as you say, then their doom cannot be long delayed." As you heard, much variation is found between this scene in the novel and in the films, and though Saruman's cinematic appearance is a terrifying force to be reckoned with, his lust for the ring and the power it would grant him here is decidedly more sinister, as Saruman here is not merely a vassal of Sauron, but a contender for his mantle, the Istari who is claimed to embody the powers of all the colors of the other wizards, the Maya with a ring of his own, and, if things had gone otherwise, the next Dark Lord in line to subjugate the free peoples of Middle-earth. In his speech to Gandalf, we also find hints of his long-lost connection to Sauron through their shared master Aule, as it was said of Sauron that his fall was made possible in part by his love of order and control, an echo of which is found in Saruman's own profession of his desire for much the same. Saruman's crimes following this act have much to do with harrying the Fellowship in an attempt to gain the ring before Sauron, as well as his marring of Rohan in so many ways, whether that be through his corruption of Grima and the poison that man spoke into the ear of King Theoden, or with the raids of both orcs and Dunlendings that saw countless villages burned and lives erased. Of particular note as well is his degradation of Isengard into a mockery of Mordor, which is exemplified for us perfectly in another excerpt from the novel. Beneath the mountain's arm within the wizard's vale, through years uncounted, had stood that ancient place that men called Isengard. Partly it was shaped in the making of the mountains, but mighty works the men of Westerness had wrought there of old, and Saruman had dwelt there long and had not been idle. This was its fashion, while Saruman was at his height, accounted by many the chief of wizards. A great ring wall of stone, like towering cliffs, stood out from the shelter of the mountainside, from which it ran and then returned again. One entrance only was there made in it, a great arch delved in the southern wall. Here through the black rock a long tunnel had been hewn, closed at either end with mighty doors of iron. They were so wrought and poised upon their huge hinges, posts of steel driven into the living stone, that when unbarred, they could be moved with a light thrust of the arms, noiselessly. One who passed in, and came at length out of the echoing tunnel, beheld a plain, a great circle, somewhat hollowed like a vast, shallow bowl. A mile it measured from rim to rim. Once it had been green, and filled with avenues, and groves of fruitful trees, watered by streams that flowed from the mountains to a lake. But no green thing grew there in the latter days of Saruman. The roads were paved with stone flags, dark and hard, and beside their borders instead of trees, there marched long lines of pillars, some of marble, some of copper and of iron, joined by heavy chains. Many houses there were, chambers, halls, and passages, cut and tunneled back into the walls upon their inner side, so that all the open circle was overlooked by countless windows and dark doors. Thousands could dwell there, workers, servants, slaves, and warriors with great store of arms. Wolves were fed and stabled in deep dens beneath. The plain, too, was bored and delved. Shafts were driven deep into the ground. Their upper ends were covered by low mounds and domes of stone, so that in the moonlight, the ring of Isengard looked like a graveyard of unquiet dead. For the ground trembled. The shafts ran down by many slopes and spiral stairs to caverns far under. There Saruman had treasuries, storehouses, armories, smithies, and great furnaces. Iron wheels revolved there endlessly, and hammers thudded. At night, plumes of vapor steamed from the vents, lit from beneath with red light, or blue, or venomous green. To the center all the roads ran between their chains. There stood a tower of marvelous shape. It was fashioned by the builders of old, who smoothed the ring of Isengard, and yet it seemed a thing not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth in the ancient torment of the hills. A peak and aisle of rock it was, black and gleaming hard. 4 mighty piers of many-sided stone were welded into one, but near the summit they opened into gaping horns, their pinnacles sharp as the points of spears, keen-edged as knives. Between them was a narrow space, and thereupon a floor of polished stone, written with strange signs. A man might stand 500 feet above the plain. This was Orthanc, the citadel of Saruman, the name of which had, by design or chance, a twofold meaning. For in the Elvish speech, Orthanc signifies Mount Fang, but in the language of the Mark of Old, the Cunning Mind. A strong place and wonderful was Isengard, and long it had been beautiful, and there great lords had dwelt, the wardens of Gondor upon the west, and wise men that watched the stars. But Saruman had slowly shaped it to his shifting purposes, and made it better, as he thought, being deceived. For all those arts and subtle devices, for which he forsook his former wisdom, and which fondly he imagined were his own, came but from Mordor, so that what he made was not, only a little copy, a child's model, or a slave's flattery of that vast fortress, armory, prison, furnace of great power, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, which suffered no rival, and laughed at flattery, biding its time, secure in its pride, and its immeasurable strength. This was the stronghold of Saruman, as fame reported it, for within living memory, the men of Rohan had not passed its gates, save perhaps a few, such as Wormtongue, who came in secret, and told no man what they saw. Now after Gandalf's imprisonment in Orthanc, we don't see too much of Saruman, but in a piece of content that was not included in the final novel that we can find in Unfinished Tales, we're given another glimpse of the power of Saruman's voice, as well as something we've seen mentioned a few times now in Saruman that always comes as a natural byproduct of jealousy, envy, and the plots and schemes one endeavors to bring to fruition in pursuit of the ruination of all that is good and free: fear and paranoia. Gollum was captured in Mordor in the year 3017 and taken to Barad-dûr, and there questioned and tormented. When he had learned what he could from him, Sauron released him and sent him forth again. He did not trust Gollum, for he divined something indomitable in him, which could not be overcome even by the shadow of fear, except by destroying him. But Sauron perceived the depth of Gollum's malice towards those that had robbed him, and guessing that he would go in search of them to avenge himself, Sauron hoped that his spies would thus be led to the ring. Gollum, however, was before long captured by Aragorn and taken to northern Mirkwood, and though he was followed, he could not be rescued before he was in safekeeping. Now Sauron had never paid heed to the halflings, even if he had heard of them, and he did not yet know where their land lay. From Gollum, even under pain, he could not get any clear account, both because Gollum indeed had no certain knowledge himself, and because what he knew, he falsified. Ultimately indomitable he was, except by death, as Sauron guessed, both from his halfling nature and from a cause which Sauron did not fully comprehend, being himself consumed by lust for the ring. Then he became filled with a hatred of Sauron even greater than his terror, seeing in him truly his greatest enemy and rival. Thus it was that he dared to pretend that he believed that the land of the halflings was near to the places where he had once dwelt, beside the banks of the Gladden. Now Sauron, learning of the capture of Gollum by the chiefs of his enemies, was in great haste and fear. Yet all his ordinary spies and emissaries could bring him no tidings, and this was due largely both to the vigilance of the Dunedain and to the treachery of Saruman, whose own servants either waylaid or misled the servants of Sauron. Of this Sauron became aware, but his arm was not yet long enough to reach Saruman in Isengard. Therefore he hid his knowledge of Saruman's double-dealing and concealed his wrath, biding his time and preparing for the great war in which he planned to sweep all his enemies into the Western Sea. At length he resolved that no others would serve him in this case, but his mightiest servants, the Ringwraiths, who had no will but his own, being each utterly subservient to the ring that had enslaved him, which Sauron held. Now few could withstand even one of these fell creatures, and, as Sauron deemed, none could withstand them when gathered together under their terrible captain, the Lord of Morgul. Yet this weakness they had for Sauron's present purpose. So great was the terror that went with them, even invisible and unclad, that their coming forth might soon be perceived, and their mission be guessed by the wise. So it was that Sauron prepared 2 strokes, in which many after saw the beginnings of the War of the Ring. They were made together. The orcs assailed the realms of Thranduil, with orders to recapture Gollum, and the Lord of Morgul was sent forth openly to battle against Gondor. These things were done towards the end of June 3018. Thus Sauron tested the strength and preparedness of Denethor, and found them more than he had hoped. But that troubled him little, since he had used little force in the assault, and his chief purpose was that the coming forth of the Nazgul should appear only as part of his policy of war against Gondor. Therefore, when Osgiliath was taken and the bridge broken, Sauron stayed the assault, and the Nazgul were ordered to begin the search for the ring. But Sauron did not underestimate the powers and vigilance of the wise, and the Nazgul were commanded to act as secretly as they could. Now at that time, the chieftain of the ring race dwelt in Minas Morgul with 6 companions, while the second to the chief, Khamul, the Shadow of the East, abode in Dol Guldur as Sauron's lieutenant, with 1 other as his messenger. The Lord of Morgul therefore led his companions over Anduin, unclad and unmounted, and invisible to eyes, and yet a terror to all living things that they passed near. It was, maybe, on the first day of July that they went forth. They passed slowly and in stealth, through Anorion, and over the Entwade, and so into the wold, and rumor of darkness, and a dread of men knew not what went before them. They reached the west shores of Anduin a little north of Sarngabir, and there received horses and raiment that were secretly ferried over the river. This was, it is thought, about the 17th of July. Then they passed northward seeking for the Shire, the land of the halflings. About the 22nd of July, they met their companions, the Nazgul of Dol Guldur, in the fields of Celebrant. There they learned that Gollum had eluded both the orcs that recaptured him and the elves that pursued them, and had vanished. They were told also by Khamul that no dwelling of halflings could be discovered in the vales of Anduin, and that the villages of the Stoors by the Gladden had long been deserted. But the Lord of Morgul, seeing no better counsel, determined still to seek northward, hoping maybe to come upon Gollum as well as to discover the Shire. That this would prove to be not far from the hated land of Lorien seemed to him not unlikely, if it was not indeed within the fences of Galadriel. But the power of the White Ring he would not defy, nor enter yet into Lorien. Passing therefore between Lorien and the mountains, the 9 rode ever on into the north, and terror went before them and lingered behind them, but they did not find what they sought, nor learn any news that availed them. At length they returned, but the summer was now far waned, and the wrath and fear of Sauron was mounting. When they came back to the wold, September had come, and there they met messengers from Barad-dûr, conveying threats from their master that filled even the Morgul lord with dismay. For Sauron had now learned of the words of prophecy heard in Gondor, and the going forth of Boromir, of Saruman's deeds, and the capture of Gandalf. From these things he concluded indeed that neither Saruman nor any other of the wise had possession yet of the ring, but that Saruman at least knew where it might be hidden. Speed alone would now serve, and secrecy must be abandoned. The ring race therefore were ordered to go straight to Isengard. They rode then through Rohan in haste, and the terror of their passing was so great that many folk fled from the land and went wildly away north and west, believing that war out of the east was coming on the heels of the Black Horses. 2 days after Gandalf had departed from Orthanc, the Lord of Morgul halted before the gate of Isengard. Then Saruman, already filled with wrath and fear by the escape of Gandalf, perceived the peril of standing between enemies, a known traitor to both. His dread was great, for his hope of deceiving Sauron, or at the least of receiving his favor and victory, was utterly lost. Now either he himself must gain the ring, or come to ruin and torment. But he was wary and cunning still, and he had ordered Isengard against such an evil chance. The circle of Isengard was too strong for even the Lord of Morgul and his company to assail without great force of war. Therefore to his challenge and demands he received only the answer of the voice of Saruman, that spoke by some art as though it came from the gate itself. "It is not a land that you look for," it said. "I know what you seek, though you do not name it. I have it not, as surely its servants perceive without telling, for if I had it, then you would bow before me and call me Lord. And if I knew where this thing was hid, I should not be here, but long gone before you to take it. There is one only whom I guess to have this knowledge, Mithrandir, enemy of Sauron. And since it is but 2 days since he departed from Isengard, seek him nearby." Such was still the power of the voice of Saruman that even the Lord of the Nazgul did not question what it said, whether it was false or short of the full truth, but straightway he rode from the gate and began to hunt for Gandalf and Rohan. Thus it was that on the evening of the next day, the Black Riders came upon Grima Wormtongue as he hastened to bring word to Saruman that Gandalf was come to Edoras and had warned King Theoden of the treacherous designs of Isengard. In that hour, the Wormtongue came near to death by terror, but being inured to treachery, he would have told all that he knew under less threat. Yea, verily I can tell you, Lord, he said, I have overheard their speech together in Isengard, the land of the halflings. It was thence that Gandalf came, and desires to return. He seeks now only a horse. Spare me, I speak as swiftly as I may, west through the gap of Rohan yonder, and then north and a little west, until the next great river bars the way. The Greyflood it is called. Thence from the crossing at Tharbad the old road will lead you to the borders. The Shire, they call it. Yea, verily, Saruman knows of it. Goods came to him from that land down the road. Spare me, Lord, indeed I will say naught of our meeting to any that live. The Lord of the Nazgul spared the life of the Wormtongue, not out of pity, but because he deemed that so great a terror was upon him that he would never dare to speak of their encounter, as proved true, and he saw that the creature was evil and was likely to do great harm yet to Saruman if he lived. So he left him lying on the ground and rode away, and did not trouble to go back to Isengard. Sauron's vengeance could wait. Now he divided his company into 4 pairs, and they rode separately, but he himself went ahead with the swiftest pair. Thus they passed west out of Rohan, and explored the desolation of Enedwaith, and came at last to Tharbad. And even though they were not yet assembled, a rumor of dread spread about them, and the creatures of the wild hid themselves, and lonely men fled away. But some fugitives on the road they captured, and to the delight of the captain, 2 proved to be spies and servants of Saruman. One of them had been used much in the traffic between Isengard and the Shire, and though he had not himself been beyond the South Farthing, he had charts prepared by Saruman which clearly depicted and described the Shire. These the Nazgul took, and then sent him on to Bree to continue spying, but warned him that he was now in the service of Mordor, and that if he ever tried to return to Isengard, they would slay him with torture. Night was waning on the 22nd day of September, when drawing together again they came to Sarn Ford and the southernmost borders of the Shire. They found them guarded, for the rangers barred their way, but this was a task beyond the power of the Dunedain, and maybe it would still have proved so, even if their captain, Aragorn, had been with them. But he was away to the north, upon the east road near Bree, and the hearts even of the Dunedain misgave them. Some fled northward, hoping to bear news to Aragorn, but they were pursued and slain or driven away into the wild. Some still dared to bar the ford, and held it while day lasted, but at night the Lord of Morgul swept them away, and the Black Riders passed into the Shire, and ere the cocks crowed in the small hours of the 23rd day of September, some were riding north through the land, even as Gandalf upon Shadowfax was riding over Rohan far behind. There is an alternate telling of this portion of the story, referred to as Narrative C, that Christopher Tolkien expanded upon in the paragraphs that followed. The story of the coming of the Black Riders to Isengard in September 3018 and their subsequent capture of Grima Wormtongue, as told in A and B, is much altered in version C, which takes up the narrative only at their return southward over the Limelight. It was 2 days after Gandalf's escape from Orthanc that the Nazgul came to Isengard. Saruman told them that Gandalf was gone and denied all knowledge of the Shire, but was betrayed by Grima, whom they captured on the following day as he hastened to Isengard with news of Gandalf's coming to Edoras. In C, on the other hand, the Black Riders arrived at the gate of Isengard while Gandalf was still a prisoner in the tower. In this account, Saruman, in fear and despair, and perceiving the full horror of service to Mordor, resolved suddenly to yield to Gandalf and to beg for his pardon and help. Temporizing at the gate, he admitted that he had Gandalf within, and said that he would go and try to discover what he knew. If that were unavailing, he would deliver Gandalf up to them. Then Saruman hastened to the summit of Orthanc, and found Gandalf gone. Away south against the setting moon, he saw a great eagle flying toward Edoras. Now Saruman's case was worse. If Gandalf had escaped, there was still a real chance that Sauron would not get the ring and would be defeated. In his heart, Saruman recognized the great power and the strange good fortune that went with Gandalf, but now he was left alone to deal with the Nine. His mood changed, and his pride reasserted itself in anger at Gandalf's escape from impenetrable Isengard, and in a fury of jealousy. He went back to the gate, and he lied, saying that he had made Gandalf confess. He did not admit that this was his own knowledge, not being aware of how much Sauron knew of his mind and heart. Earlier in this version, it is said that Sauron had at this time, by means of the Palantiri, at last begun to daunt Saruman, and could in any case often read his thought, even when he withheld information. Thus Sauron was aware that Saruman had some guess at the place where the ring was, and Saruman actually revealed that he had got as his prisoner Gandalf, who knew the most. "I will report this myself to the Lord of Barad-dûr," he said loftily, "to whom I speak from afar on great matters that concern us. But all that you need to know on the mission that he has given you is where the Shire lies. That," says Mithrandir, "is northwest from here some 600 miles, on the borders of the seaward Elvish country." To his pleasure, Saruman saw that even the Witch King did not relish that. "You must cross Isen by the fords, and then rounding the mountain's end, make for Tharbad upon Greyflood. Go with speed, and I will report to your master that you have done so." This skillful speech convinced even the Witch King for the moment that Saruman was a faithful ally, high in Sauron's confidence. At once the riders left the gate and rode in haste to the fords of Isen. Behind them, Saruman sent out wolves and orcs in vain pursuit of Gandalf, but in this he had other purposes also. To impress his power upon the Nazgul, perhaps also to prevent them from lingering near, and in his anger, he wished to do some injury to Rohan, and to increase the fear of him, which his agent Wormtongue was building up in Theoden's heart. Wormtongue had been in Isengard not long since, and was then on his way back to Edoras. Among the pursuers were some bearing messages to him. When he was rid of the riders, Saruman retired to Orthanc, and sat in earnest and dreadful thought. It seems that he resolved still to temporize, and still to hope to get the ring for himself. He thought that the direction of the riders to the Shire might hinder them rather than help them, for he knew of the guard of the Rangers, knowing of the oracular dream words, and of Boromir's mission, that the ring had gone and was already on the way to Rivendell. At once he marshaled and sent out into Eriador all the spies, spybirds, and agents that he could muster. In this version, the element of Grima's capture by the Ringwraiths and his betrayal of Saruman is thus absent, for of course there is insufficient time by this account for Gandalf to reach Edoras and attempt to warn King Theoden, and for Grima in his turn to set out for Isengard to warn Saruman before the Black Riders were already gone from Rohan. The revelation of Saruman's lying to them here comes about through the man whom they captured and found to be bearing maps of the Shire, and more is told of this man and of Saruman's dealings with the Shire. When the Black Riders were far across Enedwaith, and drawing near at last to Tharbad, they had what was for them a great stroke of good fortune, but disastrous for Saruman, and deadly perilous for Frodo. Saruman had long taken an interest in the Shire, because Gandalf did, and he was suspicious of him, and because, again in secret imitation of Gandalf, he had taken to the Halfling's Leaf, and needed supplies, but in pride, having once scoffed at Gandalf's use of the weed, kept this as secret as he could. Latterly, other motives were added. He liked to extend his power, especially into Gandalf's province, and he found that the money he could provide for the purchase of Leaf was giving him power and was corrupting some of the hobbits, especially the Bracegirdles, who owned many plantations, and so also the Saxville Bagginses. But also, he had begun to feel certain that in some way, the Shire was connected with the ring in Gandalf's mind. Why this strong guard upon it? He therefore began to collect detailed information about the Shire, its chief persons and families, its roads, and other matters. For this he used hobbits within the Shire, in the pay of the Bracegirdles and the Saxville Bagginses, but his agents were men of Dunlandish origin. When Gandalf had refused to treat with him, Saruman had redoubled his efforts. The Rangers were suspicious, but did not actually refuse entry to the servants of Saruman, for Gandalf was not at liberty to warn them, and when he had gone off to Isengard, Saruman was still recognized as an ally. Some while ago, one of Saruman's most trusted servants, yet a ruffianly fellow, an outlaw driven from Dunland, where many said that he had orc blood, had returned from the borders of the Shire, where he had been negotiating for the purchase of Leaf and other supplies. Saruman was beginning to store Isengard against war. This man was now on his way back to continue the business, and to arrange for the transport of many goods before autumn failed. He had orders also to get into the Shire if possible, and learn if there had been any departures of persons well known recently. He was well supplied with maps, lists of names, and notes concerning the Shire. The Dunlanding was overtaken by several of the Black Riders as they approached the Tharbad crossing. In an extremity of terror, he was hailed to the Witch King and questioned. He saved his life by betraying Saruman. The Witch King thus learned that Saruman knew well all along where the Shire was, and knew much about it, which he could and should have told to Sauron's servants if he had been a true ally. The Witch King also obtained much information, including some about the only name that interested him, Baggins. It was for this reason that Hobbiton was singled out as one of the points for immediate visit and enquiry. The Witch King had now a clearer understanding of the matter. He had known something of the country long ago, in his wars with the Dunedain, and especially of the Tirn Gorthod of Cardolan, now the Barrow Downs, whose evil wights had been sent there by himself. Seeing that his master suspected some move between the Shire and Rivendell, he saw also that Bree, the position of which he knew, would be an important point, at least for information. He put therefore the Shadow of Fear on the Dunlending and sent him on to Bree as an agent. He was the squint-eyed southerner at the inn. As I stated before reading this excerpt for you, this portion of Unfinished Tales does an excellent job of displaying for us the power of Saruman's voice and his cunning, especially in regards to how he infiltrated the Shire before the story began. But it also shows us that even though Saruman was by all accounts haughty, arrogant, and prideful in the way he conducted himself, especially after his fall, he still harbored within him a certain amount of regret for what he had done and what he had unleashed, and that he feared the entity he would try so desperately to ally himself with or overthrow. Whatever fear lay in the heart of Saruman, however, was no match for his ambition, and so with his great skills in all manner of crafts as well as biology, Saruman went about ordering a dreaded force of orcs, Uruk-hai, and war machines that soon grew to be a great shadow of Sauron's power, a power that he would turn towards Rohan after his spell over Theoden had been sundered by the returned Gandalf, a feat of manipulation that can be counted as one of his more ingenious acts during his quest for power. The breaking of Theoden via Grima is the best example we're given of Saruman's talent for manipulation, and had he not been thwarted by Gandalf here, it's entirely possible that Saruman could have eliminated Rohan as a threat in this war by continuing to turn the people of that land against one another, or even by bending them to his will so they might bolster the forces of darkness, however unlikely that may have been, considering the great opposition to his inroads made by the other Rohirrim. But like many things Saruman endeavored to do, this was an overreach that ended up harming his aims more than it helped him. Even so, his attempt to conquer Rohan following Theoden's release was nearly successful, as the discord he had sown between Theoden and the rest of his kin nearly ensured their defeat, which is something that's explained to us in greater detail than it was in the novel, in the chapter of Unfinished Tales titled The Battles of the Fords of Isen. The chief obstacles to an easy conquest of Rohan by Saruman were Theodred and Éomer. They were vigorous men, devoted to the king, and high in his affections, as his only son and his sister son, and they did all that they could to thwart the influence over him that Grima gained when the king's health began to fail. This occurred early in the year 3014, when Theoden was 66. His malady may thus have been due to natural causes, though the Rohirrim commonly lived till near or beyond their 80th year. But it may well have been induced or increased by subtle poisons, administered by Grima. In any case, Theoden's sense of weakness and dependence on Grima was largely due to the cunning and skill of this evil counselor's suggestions. It was his policy to bring his chief opponents into discredit with Theoden, and if possible, to get rid of them. It proved impossible to set them at odds with one another. Theoden, before his sickness, had been much loved by all his kin and people, and the loyalty of Theodred and Éomer remained steadfast, even in his apparent dotage. Éomer also was not an ambitious man, and his love and respect for Theodred, 13 years older than he, was only second to his love of his foster father. Grima therefore tried to play them one against the other in the mind of Theoden, representing Éomer as ever eager to increase his own authority and to act without consulting the king or his heir. In this he had some success, which bore fruit when Saruman at last succeeded in achieving the death of Theodred. It was clearly seen in Rohan, when the true accounts of the battles of the Fords were known, that Saruman had given special orders that Theodred should at all costs be slain. At the first battle, all his fiercest warriors were engaged in reckless assaults upon Theodred and his guard, disregarding other events of the battle, which might otherwise have resulted in a much more damaging defeat for the Rohirrim. When Theodred was at last slain, Saruman's commander, no doubt under orders, seemed satisfied for the time being, and Saruman made the mistake, fatal as it proved, of not immediately throwing in more forces and proceeding at once to a massive invasion of Westfold, though the valor of Grimbold and Elfhelm contributed to his delay. If the invasion of Westfold had begun 5 days earlier, there can be little doubt that the reinforcements from Edoras would never have come near Helm's Deep, but would have been surrounded and overwhelmed in the open plain, if indeed Edoras had not itself been attacked and captured before the arrival of Gandalf. It has been said that the valor of Grimbold and Elfhelm contributed to Saruman's delay, which proved disastrous for him. The above account perhaps underestimates its importance. The Isen came down swiftly from its source above Isengard, but in the flat land of the Gap, it became slow until it turned west. Then it flowed on through country, falling by long slopes down into the low-lying coastlands of furthest Gondor and the Enedwaith, and it became deep and rapid. Just above this westward bend were the Fords of Isen. There the river was broad and shallow, passing in two arms about a large 8, over a stony shelf covered with stones and pebbles brought down from the north. Only here, south of Isengard, was it possible for large forces, especially those heavily armed or mounted, to cross the river. Saruman thus had this advantage. He could send his troops down either side of the Isen and attack the fords if they were held against him from both sides. Any force of his west of Isen could, if necessary, retreat upon Isengard. On the other hand, Theodred might send men across the fords, either in sufficient strength to engage Saruman's troops or to defend the western bridgehead. But if they were worsted, they would have no retreat except back over the fords with the enemy at their heels, and possibly also awaiting them on the eastern bank. South and west along the Isen, they had no way home, unless they were provisioned for a long journey into western Gondor. Saruman's attack was not unforeseen, but it came sooner than was expected. Theodred's scouts had warned him of a mustering of troops before the gates of Isengard, mainly, as it seemed, on the west side of Isen. He therefore manned the east and west approaches to the fords with sturdy men on foot from the levies of Westfold. Leaving 3 companies of riders, together with horse herds and spare mounts, on the east bank, he himself passed over with the main strength of his cavalry, 8 companies and a company of archers, intending to overthrow Saruman's army before it was fully prepared. But Saruman had not revealed his intentions, nor the full strength of his forces. They were already on the march when Theodred set out. Some 20 miles north of the fords he encountered their vanguard and scattered it with loss. But when he rode on to attack the main host, the resistance stiffened. The enemy was in fact in positions prepared for the event, behind trenches manned by pikemen, and Theodred and the leading Eored was brought to a stand and almost surrounded, for new forces hastening from Isengard were now outflanking him upon the west. He was extricated by the onset of the companies coming up behind him, but as he looked eastward, he was dismayed. It had been a dim and misty morning, but the mists were now rolling back through the gap on a breeze from the west, and away east of the river he described other forces now hasting towards the fords, though their strength could not be guessed. He at once ordered a retreat. This the riders, well trained in the maneuver, managed in good order and with little further loss, but the enemy was not shaken off or long outdistanced, for the retreat was often delayed when the rearguard under Grimbold was obliged to turn at bay and drive back the most eager of their pursuers. When Theodred gained the fords, the day was waning. He set Grimbold in command of the garrison of the west bank, stiffened with 50 dismounted riders. The rest of his riders, and all the horses, he at once sent across the river, save his own company. With these on foot he manned the 8, to cover the retreat of Grimbold if he was driven back. This was barely done when disaster came. Saruman's eastern force came down with unexpected speed. It was much smaller than the western force, but more dangerous. In its van were some Dunlanding horsemen, and a great pack of the dreadful Orcish wolf riders, feared by horses. Behind them came 2 battalions of the fierce Uruks, heavily armed, but trained to move at great speed for many miles. The horsemen and wolf riders fell on the horse herds and picketed horses and slew or dispersed them. The garrison of the east bank, surprised by the sudden assault of the massed Uruks, was swept away, and the riders that had just crossed from the west were caught still in disarray. And though they fought desperately, they were driven from the fords along the line of the Isen with the Uruks in pursuit. As soon as the enemy had gained possession of the eastern end of the fords, there appeared a company of men or Orcmen, evidently dispatched for the purpose, ferocious, mail-clad, and armed with axes. They hastened to the aid and assailed it from both sides. At the same time, Grimbold on the west bank was attacked by Saruman's forces on that side of the Isen. As he looked eastward, dismayed by the sounds of battle and the hideous orc cries of victory, he saw the axemen driving Theodred's men from the shores of the 8 towards the lone knoll in its center, and he heard Theodred's great voice crying, "To me, Arolingus." At once Grimbold, taking a few men that stood near him, ran back to the 8. So fierce was his onset from the rear of the attackers that Grimbold, a man of great strength and stature, clove his way through, till with 2 others he reached Theodred standing at bay on the knoll. Too late. As he came to his side, Theodred fell, hewn down by a great orc man. Grimbold slew him and took over the body of Theodred, thinking him dead, and there he would himself soon have died but for the coming of Elfhelm. Elfhelm had been riding in haste along the horse road from Edoras, leading 4 companies in answer to Theodred's summons. He was expecting battle, but not yet for some days. But near the junction of the horse road with the road down from the Deeping, his outriders on the right flank reported that 2 wolf riders had been seen abroad on the fields. Sensing that things were amiss, he did not turn aside to Helm's Deep for the night, as he had intended, but rode with all speed towards the fords. The horse road turned northwest after its meeting with the Deeping road, but again bent sharply west when level with the fords, which it approached by a straight path of some 2 miles long. Elfhelm thus heard and saw nothing of the fighting between the retreating garrison and the Uruks south of the fords. The sun had sunk, and light was failing when he drew near the last bend in the road, and there encountered some horses running wild and a few fugitives who told him of the disaster. Though his men and horses were now weary, he rode as fast as he could along the strait, and as he came in sight of the east bank, he ordered his companies to charge. It was the turn of the Isengarders to be surprised. They heard the thunder of hooves, and saw coming like black shadows against the darkening east, a great host, as it seemed, with Elfhelm at its head, and beside him a white standard borne as a guide to those that followed. Few stood their ground. Most fled northwards, pursued by 2 of Elfhelm's companies. The others he dismounted to guard the east bank, but at once with the men of his own company rushed to the aid. The axemen were now caught between the surviving defenders and the onslaught of Elfhelm, with both banks still held by the Rohirrim. They fought on, but before the end were slain to a man. Elfhelm himself, however, sprang up towards the knoll, and there he found Grimbold fighting 2 great axemen for possession of Theodred's body. One Elfhelm at once slew, and the other fell before Grimbold. They stooped then to lift the body, and found that Theodred still breathed, but he lived only long enough to speak his last words. "Let me lie here, to keep the fords, till Eomer comes." Night fell, a harsh horn sounded, and then all was silent. The attack on the west bank ceased, and the enemy there faded away into the dark. The Rohirrim held the fords of Isen, but their losses were heavy, not least in horses. The king's son was dead, and they were leaderless, and did not know what might yet befall. When after a cold and sleepless night, the grey light returned, there was no sign of the Isengarders, save those many that they left dead upon the field. Wolves were howling far off, waiting for the living men to depart. Many men scattered by the sudden assault of the Isengarders began to return, some still mounted, some leading horses were captured. Later in the morning, most of Theodred's riders that had been driven south down the river by a battalion of Black Uruks came back battle-worn, but in good order. They had a like tale to tell. They came to a stand on a low hill and prepared to defend it. Though they had driven off part of the attacking force of Isengard, retreat south unprovisioned was in the end hopeless. The Uruks had resisted any attempt to burst eastwards, and were driving them towards the now hostile country of the Dunlandish West March. But as the riders prepared to resist their assault, though it was now full night, a horn was sounded, and soon they discovered that the enemy had gone. They had too few horses to attempt any pursuit, or even to act as scouts, so far as that would have availed by night. After some time, they began cautiously to advance north again, but met no opposition. They thought that the Uruks had gone back to reinforce their hold on the fords, and expected there to meet in battle again, and they wondered much to find the Rohirrim in command. It was not till later that they discovered whither the Uruks had gone. So ended the first battle of the fords of Isen. Of the second battle, no such clear accounts were ever made, owing to the much greater events that immediately followed. Erkenbrand of Westfold assumed command of the Westmark when news of the fall of Theodred reached him in the Hornburg on the next day. He sent errand riders to Edoras to announce this, and to bear to Theoden his son's last words, adding his own prayer that Eomer should be sent at once with all help that could be spared. "Let the defense of Edoras be made here in the west," he said, "and not wait till it is itself besieged." But Grima used the curtness of this advice to further his policy of delay. It was not until his defeat by Gandalf that any action was taken. The reinforcements with Eomer and the king himself set out in the afternoon of March the 2nd. But that night, the second battle of the fords was fought and lost, and the invasion of Rohan began. Erkenbrand did not at once himself proceed to the battlefield. All was in confusion. He did not know what forces he could muster in haste, nor could he yet estimate the losses that Theodred's troops had actually suffered. He judged rightly that invasion was imminent, but that Saruman would not dare to pass on eastward to attack Edoras, while the fortress of the Hornburg was unreduced, if it was manned and well stored. With this business and the gathering of such men of Westfold as he could, he was occupied for 3 days. The command in the field he gave to Grimbold, until he could come himself, but he assumed no command over Elfhelm and his riders, who belonged to the muster of Edoras. The 2 commanders were friends and both loyal and wise men, and there was no dissension between them. The ordering of their forces was a compromise between their differing opinions. Elfhelm held that the fords were no longer important, but rather a snare to entrap men better placed elsewhere, since Saruman could clearly send forces down either side of the Isen, as suited his purpose. And his immediate purpose would undoubtedly be to overrun Westfold and invest the Hornburg before any effective help could come from Edoras. His army, or most of it, would therefore come down the east side of the Isen, for though by that way, over rougher ground without roads, their approach would be slower, they would not have to force the passage of the fords. Elfhelm therefore advised that the fords should be abandoned. All the available men on foot should be assembled on the east side and placed in a position to hold up the advance of the enemy. a long line of rising ground running from west to east, some few miles north of the fords, but the cavalry should be withdrawn eastward to a point from which, when the advancing enemy was engaged with the defense, a charge with the greatest impact could be delivered on their flank and drive them into the river. Let Isen be their snare, and not ours. Grimbold, on the other hand, was not willing to abandon the fords. This was in part due to the tradition of Westfold, in which he and Erkenbrand had been bred, but was not without some reason. "We do not know," he said, "what force Saruman has still at his command, but if it is indeed his purpose to ravage Westfold and drive its defenders into Helm's Deep and there contain them, then it must be very great. He is unlikely to display it all at once. As soon as he guesses or discovers how we have disposed our defense, he will certainly send great strength at all speed down the road from Isengard, and crossing the undefended fords come in our rear, if we are all gathered northwards." In the end, Grimbold manned the western end of the fords with the greater part of his foot soldiers. There they were in a strong position in the earth forts that guarded the approaches. He remained with the rest of his men, including what remained to him of Theodred's cavalry, on the east bank. The 8 he left bare. Elfhelm, however, withdrew his riders and took up his position on the line where he had wished the main defense to stand. His purpose was to descry as soon as could be any attack coming down on the east of the river and to disperse it before it could reach the fords. All went ill, as most likely it would have done in any case. Saruman's strength was too great. He began his attack by day, and before noon of March the 2nd, a strong force of his best fighters, coming down by the road from Isengard, attacked the forts on the west of the fords. This force was in fact only a small part of those that he had in hand, no more than he deemed sufficient to dispose of the weakened defense. But the garrison of the fords, though greatly outnumbered, resisted stubbornly. At length, however, when both the forts were heavily engaged, a troop of Uruks forced the passage between them and began to cross the fords. Grimbold, trusting in Elfhelm to hold off attack on the east side, came across with all the men he had left and flung them back, for a while. But the enemy commander then threw in a battalion that had not been committed and broke the defenses. Grimbold was obliged to withdraw across the Isen. It was then near sunset. He had suffered much loss, but had inflicted far heavier losses on the enemy, mostly orcs, and he still held the east bank strongly. The enemy did not attempt to cross the fords and fight their way up the steep slopes to dislodge him. Not yet. Elfhelm had been unable to take part in this action. In the dusk he withdrew his companies and retired towards Grimbold's camp, setting his men in groups at some distance from it to act as a screen against attack from north and east. From southwards they expected no evil, and hoped for succor. After the retreat across the fords, errand riders had been dispatched at once to Erkenbrand and to Edoras telling of their plight. Fearing, indeed knowing, that greater evil would befall them ere long, unless help beyond hope reached them swiftly, the defenders prepared to do what they could to hold up Saruman's advance before they were overwhelmed. The greater part stood to arms, only a few at a time attempting to snatch such brief rest and sleep as they could. Grimbold and Elfhelm were sleepless, awaiting the dawn and dreading what it might bring. They did not have to wait so long. It was not yet midnight when points of red light were seen coming from the north and already drawing near on the west of the river. It was the vanguard of the whole remaining forces of Saruman that he was now committing to battle for the conquest of Westfold. They came on at great speed, and suddenly all the host burst into flame, as it seemed. Hundreds of torches were kindled from those borne by the leaders of troops, and gathering into their stream the forces already manning the west bank, they swept over the fords like a river of fire with a great clamor of hate. A great company of bowmen might have made them rue the light of their torches, but Grimbold had only a handful of archers. He could not hold the east bank, and withdrew from it, forming a great shield wall about his camp. Soon it was surrounded, and the attackers cast torches among them, and some they sent high over the heads of the shield wall, hoping to kindle fires among the stores and terrify such horses as Grimbold still had. But the shield wall held. Then, since the orcs were of less avail in such fighting because of their stature, fierce companions of the Dunlandish hillmen were thrown against it. But for all their hatred, the Dunlandings were still afraid of the Rohirrim if they met face to face, and they were also less skilled in warfare and less well armed. The shield wall still held. In vain, Grimbold looked for help to come from Elfhelm. None came. At last then he determined to carry out if he could the plan that he had already made if he should find himself in just such a desperate position. He had at length recognized the wisdom of Elfhelm, and understood that though his men might fight on till all were slain, and would if he ordered it, such valor would not help Erkenbrand. Any man that could break out and escape southwards would be more useful, though he might seem inglorious. The night had been overcast and dark, but now the waxing moon began to glimmer through drifting cloud. A wind was moving from the east, the forerunner of the great storm that when day came would pass over Rohan and burst out over Helm's Deep the next night. Grimbold was aware suddenly that most of the torches had been extinguished, and the fury of the assault had abated. He therefore at once mounted those riders for whom horses were available, not many more than half an Aored, and placed them under the command of Duneray. The shield wall was opened on the east side, and the riders passed through, driving back their assailants on that side. Then dividing and wheeling round, they charged the enemy to the north and south of the camp. The sudden maneuver was for a space successful. The enemy was confused and dismayed. Many thought at first that a large force of riders had come from the east. Grimbold himself remained on foot with a rearguard of picked men, already chosen, and covered for the moment by these and the riders under Duneray. The remainder retreated with what speed they could. But Saruman's commander soon perceived that the shield wall was broken and the defenders in flight. Fortunately, the moon was overtaken by cloud, and all was dark again, and he was in haste. He did not allow his troops to press the pursuit of the fugitives far into the darkness, now that the fords were captured. He gathered his force as best he could and made for the road southward. So it was that the great part of Grimbold's men survived. They were scattered in the night, but, as he had ordered, they made their ways away from the road, east of the great turn where it bent west towards the Isen. They were relieved, but amazed to encounter no enemies, not knowing that a large army had already some hours before passed southward, and that Isengard was now guarded by little but its own strength of wall and gate. It was for this reason that no help had come from Elfhelm. More than half of Saruman's force had actually been sent down east of Isen. They came on more slowly than the western division, for the land was rougher and without roads, and they bore no lights. But before them, swift and silent, went several troops of the dreaded wolf riders. Before Elfhelm had any warning of the approach of enemies on his side of the river, the wolf riders were between him and Grimbold's camp, and they were also attempting to surround each of his small groups of riders. It was dark, and all his force was in disarray. He gathered all that he could into a close body of horsemen, but he was obliged to retreat eastward. He could not reach Grimbold, though he knew he was in straits and had been about to come to his aid when attacked by the wolf riders. But he also guessed rightly that the wolf riders were only the forerunners of a force far too great for him to oppose, that would make for the southward road. The night was wearing away. He could only await the dawn. What followed is less clear, since only Gandalf had full knowledge of it. He received news of the disaster only in the late afternoon of March the 3rd. The king was then at a point not far east of the junction of the road with the branch going to the Hornburg. From there it was about 90 miles in a direct line to Isengard, and Gandalf must have ridden there with the greatest speed that Shadowfax could command. He reached Isengard in the early darkness, and left again in no more than 20 minutes, both on the outward journey, when his direct route would take him close to the fords, and on his return south to find Erkenbrand. He must have met Grimbold and Elfhelm. They were convinced that he was acting for the king, not only by his appearance on Shadowfax, but also by his knowledge of the name of the errand rider, Carol, and the message that he brought, and they took as orders the advice that he gave. Grimbold's men he sent southward to join Erkenbrand. As grievous as these blows to Rohan were, in the end, as all of you know well, Saruman's forces were defeated at the Battle of Helm's Deep, suffering a blow that he may have been able to stymie were it not for the Ents, whom Saruman paid no heed to whatsoever as he savaged their lands and burnt many of their number to cinders. And with the crushing defeat at Helm's Deep, and Isengard brought to ruin at the hands of Treebeard and his kin, Saruman was all but defeated. In the films, in the extended version at least, this defeat is met with spite, fury, and scathing words to Gandalf and friends once they arrive at Isengard, before Grima finally puts an end to him. But in the novel, there is much more said between Saruman and Gandalf's party, and not all of it was said with as much venom as it was in the film. I read for you a portion of this passage earlier when talking about the power of Saruman's voice, and while you don't necessarily need to hear it again, this excerpt doesn't make much sense without it, so I will be repeating it, just so you're aware. Gandalf stood before the door of Orthanc and beat on it with his staff. It rang with a hollow sound. "Saruman!" he cried in a loud, commanding voice. "Saruman, come forth!" For some time there was no answer. At last the window above the door was unbarred, but no figure could be seen at its dark opening. "Who is it?" said a voice. "What do you wish?" Theoden started. "I know that voice," he said, "and I curse the day when I first listened to it." "Go and fetch Saruman, since you have become his footman, Grima Wormtongue," said Gandalf, "and do not waste our time." The window closed. They waited. Suddenly another voice spoke, low and melodious, its very sound an enchantment. Those who listened unwarily to that voice could seldom report the words that they heard, and if they did, they wondered, for little power remained in them. Mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that it said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. When others spoke, they seemed harsh and uncouth by contrast, and if they gainsaid the voice, anger was kindled in the hearts of those under the spell. For some, the spell lasted only while the voice spoke to them, and when it spoke to another they smiled, as men do who see through a juggler's trick, while others gape at it. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled, but for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved. None rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. "Well," it said now with gentle question, "why must you disturb my rest? Will you give me no peace at all by night or day?" Its tone was that of a kindly heart aggrieved by injuries undeserved. They looked up, astonished, for they had heard no sound of his coming, and they saw a figure standing at the rail, looking down upon them. An old man, swathed in a great cloak, the color of which was not easy to tell, for it changed if they moved their eyes, or if he stirred. His face was long, with a high forehead, darkling eyes, hard to fathom, though the look that they now bore was grave and benevolent and a little weary. His hair and beard were white, but strands of black still showed about his lips and ears. "Like, and yet unlike," muttered Gimli. "But come now," said the soft voice. "Two at least of you I know by name. Gandalf I know too well to have much hope that he seeks help or counsel here. But you, Theoden, Lord of the Mark of Rohan, are declared by your noble devices, and still more by the fair countenance of the house of Aule. O worthy son of Thangol the thrice renowned, why have you not come before, and as a friend? Much have I desired to see you, mightiest king of western lands, and especially in these latter years, to save you from the unwise and evil counsels that beset you. Is it yet too late, despite the injuries that have been done to me, in which the men of Rohan, alas, have had some part? Still I would save you, and deliver you from the ruin that draws nigh inevitably, if you ride upon the road which you have taken. Indeed, I alone can aid you now." Theoden opened his mouth as if to speak, but he said nothing. He looked up at the face of Saruman with its dark, solemn eyes bent down upon him, and then to Gandalf at his side, and he seemed to hesitate. Gandalf made no sign, but stood silent as stone, as one waiting patiently for some call that has not yet come. The riders stirred at first, murmuring with approval of the words of Saruman, and then they too were silent, as men spellbound. It seemed to them that Gandalf had never spoken so fair and fittingly to their lord. Rough and proud now seemed all his dealings with Theoden, and over their hearts crept a shadow, the fear of a great danger, the end of the mark in a darkness to which Gandalf was driving them, while Saruman stood beside a door of escape, holding it half open so that a ray of light came through. There was a heavy silence. It was Gimli the dwarf who broke in suddenly. "The words of this wizard stand on their heads," he growled, gripping the handle of his axe. "In the language of Orthanc, help means ruin, and saving means slaying. That is plain. But we do not come here to beg." "Peace," said Saruman, and for a fleeting moment his voice was less suave, and a light flickered in his eyes and was gone. "I do not speak to you yet, Gimli Gloin's son," he said. "Far away is your home, and small concern of yours are the troubles of this land. But it was not by design of your own that you became embroiled in them, and so I will not blame such part as you have played. A valiant one, I doubt not. But I pray you allow me to first speak with the king of Rohan, my neighbor, and once my friend. What have you to say, Theoden King? Will you have peace with me, and all the aid that my knowledge, founded in long years, can bring? Shall we make our counsels together against evil days, and repair our injuries with such goodwill that our estates shall both come to fairer flower than ever before?" Still Theoden did not answer. Whether he strove with anger or doubt, none could say. Éomer spoke. "Lord, hear me," he said. "Now we feel the peril that we were warned of. Have we ridden forth to victory, only to stand at last amazed by an old liar with honey on his forked tongue? So would the trapped wolf speak to the hounds, if he could. What aid can he give to you, forsooth? All he desires is to escape from his plight. But will you parley with this dealer in treachery and murder? Remember Theodred at the fords, and the grave of Hama in Helm's Deep. If we speak of poisoned tongues, what shall we say of yours, young serpent?" said Saruman, and the flash of his anger was now plain to see. "But come, Éomer, Éomen's son," he went on in his soft voice again. To every man his part. Valor in arms is yours, and you win high honor thereby. Slay whom your lord names as enemies, and be content. Meddle not in policies which you do not understand, but maybe, if you become a king, you will find that he must choose his friends with care. The friendship of Saruman and the power of Orthanc cannot be lightly thrown aside, whatever grievances, real or fancied, may lie behind. You have won a battle, but not a war, and that with help on which you cannot count again. You may find the shadow of the wood at your own door next. It is wayward and senseless, and has no love for men. But my lord of Rohan, am I to be called a murderer because valiant men have fallen in battle? If you go to war, needlessly, for I did not desire it, then men will be slain. But if I am a murderer on that account, then all the house of Aule is stained with murder, for they have fought many wars and assailed many who defied them. Yet with some they have afterwards made peace, none the worse for being politic. I say, Theoden King, shall we have peace and friendship, you and I? It is ours to command. We will have peace, said Theoden at last, thickly and with an effort. Several of the riders cried out gladly. Theoden held up his hand. Yes, we will have peace when you and all your works have perished, and the works of your dark master to whom you would deliver us. You are a liar, Saruman, and a corrupter of men's hearts. You hold out your hand to me, and I perceive only a finger of the claw of Mordor, cruel and cold. Even if your war on me was just, as it was not, for were you 10 times as wise, you would have no right to rule me and mine for your own profit as you desired. Even so, what will you say of your torches in Westfold and the children that lie dead there? And they hewed Hama's body before the gates of the Hornburg after he was dead. When you hang from a gibbet at your window for the sport of your own crows, I will have peace with you and Orthanc. So much for the house of Aule. A lesser son of great sires am I, but I do not need to lick your fingers. Turn elsewhither, but I fear your voice has lost its charm. The riders gazed up at Theoden like men startled out of a dream. Harsh as an old raven's their master's voice sounded in their ears after the music of Saruman. But Saruman for a while was beside himself with wrath. He leaned over the rail as if he would smite the king with his staff. To some suddenly it seemed they saw a snake coiling itself to strike. Gibbets and crows, he hissed, and they shuddered at the hideous change. Dotard! What is the house of Aule but a thatched barn where brigands drink in the reek, and their brats roll on the floor among the dogs? Too long have they escaped the gibbet themselves, but the noose comes, slow in the drawing, tight and hard in the end. Hang if you will. Now his voice changed, as he slowly mastered himself. I know not why I have had the patience to speak to you, for I need you not, nor your little band of gallopers, as swift to fly as to advance, Theoden Horsemaster. Long ago I offered you a state beyond your merit and your wit. I have offered it again, so that those whom you mislead may clearly see the choice of roads. You give me brag and abuse, so be it. Go back to your huts, but you, Gandalf, for you at least I am grieved, feeling for your shame. How comes it that you can endure such company? For you are proud, Gandalf, and not without reason, having a noble mind and eyes that look both deep and far. Even now will you not listen to my counsel? Gandalf stirred and looked up. What have you to say that you did not say at our last meeting? He asked. Or you have things to unsay? Saruman paused. Unsay? He mused, as if puzzled. Unsay? I endeavored to advise you for your own good, but you scarcely listened. You are proud and do not love advice, having indeed a store of your own wisdom. But on that occasion you erred, I think, misconstruing my intentions willfully. I fear that in my eagerness to persuade you, I lost patience, and indeed, I regret it, for I bore you no ill will, and even now I bear none, though you return to me in the company of the violent and the ignorant. How should I? Are we not both members of a high and ancient order, most excellent in Middle-earth? Our friendship would profit us both alike. Much we could still accomplish together to heal the disorders of the world. Let us understand one another and dismiss from thought these lesser folk. Let them wait on our decisions. For the common good, I am willing to redress the past and to receive you. Will you not consult with me? Will you not come up? So great was the power that Saruman exerted in this last effort that none that stood within hearing were unmoved. But now the spell was wholly different. They heard the gentle remonstrance of a kindly king with an erring but much loved minister. But they were shut out, listening at a door to words not meant for them. Ill-mannered children or stupid servants overhearing the elusive discourse of their elders and wondering how it would affect their lot. Of loftier mold these two men were made, reverend, and wise, it was inevitable that they should make alliance. Gandalf would ascend into the tower to discuss deep things beyond their comprehension in the high chambers of Orthanc. The door would be closed, and they would be left outside, dismissed to await allotted work or punishment. Even in the mind of Theoden, the thought took shape, like a shadow of doubt. He will betray us. He will go. We shall be lost. Then Gandalf laughed. The fantasy vanished like a puff of smoke. Saruman, Saruman, said Gandalf, still laughing. Saruman, you missed your path in life. You should have been the king's jester and earned your bread, and stripes too, by mimicking his counselors. Ah me, he paused, getting the better of his mirth. Understand one another. I fear I am beyond your comprehension. But you, Saruman, I understand now too well. I keep a clearer memory of your arguments and deeds than you suppose. When last I visited you, you were the jailer of Mordor, and there I was to be sent. Nay, the guest who has escaped from the roof will think twice before he comes back in by the door. Nay, I do not think I will come up. But listen, Saruman, for the last time, will you not come down? Isengard has proved less strong than your hope and fancy made it. So may other things in which you still have trust. Would it not be well to leave it for a while, to turn to new things perhaps? Think well, Saruman. Will you not come down? A shadow passed over Saruman's face. Then it went deathly white. Before he could conceal it, they saw through the mask the anguish of a mind in doubt, loathing to stay and dreading to leave its refuge. For a second he hesitated, and no one breathed. Then he spoke, and his voice was shrill and cold. Pride and hate were conquering him. "Will I come down?" he mocked. "Does an unarmed man come down to speak with robbers out of doors? I can hear you well enough here. I am no fool, and I do not trust you, Gandalf. They do not stand openly on my stairs, but I know where the wild wood demons are lurking at your command." "The treacherous are ever distrustful," answered Gandalf wearily, "but you need not fear for your skin. I do not wish to kill you or hurt you, as you would know if you really understood me, and I have the power to protect you. I am giving you a last chance. You can leave Orthanc, free, if you choose." "That sounds well," sneered Saruman. "Very much in the manner of Gandalf the Grey, so condescending and so very kind. I do not doubt that you would find Orthanc commodious, and my departure convenient. But why should I wish to leave? And what do you mean by free? There are conditions, I presume." "Reasons for leaving you can see from your windows," answered Gandalf. "Others will occur to your thought. Your servants are destroyed and scattered. Your neighbors you have made your enemies, and you have cheated your new master, or tried to do so. When his eye turns hither, it will be the red eye of wrath. But when I say free, I mean free. Free from bond, of chain or command, to go where you will, even to Mordor, Saruman, if you desire. But you will first surrender to me the key of Orthanc and your staff. They shall be pledges of your conduct, to be returned later, if you merit them." Saruman's face grew livid, twisted with rage, and a red light was kindling in his eyes. He laughed wildly. "Later," he cried, and his voice rose to a scream. "Later! Yes, when you also have the keys of Barad-dûr itself, I suppose, and the crowns of 7 kings, and the rods of the 5 wizards, and have purchased yourself a pair of boots many sizes larger than those that you wear now. A modest plan, hardly one in which my help is needed. I have other things to do. Do not be a fool. If you wish to treat with me, while you have a chance, go away and come back when you are sober, and leave behind these cutthroats and small ragtag that bandle at your tail. Good day." He turned and left the balcony. "Come back, Saruman," said Gandalf in a commanding voice. To the amazement of the others, Saruman turned again, and as if dragged against his will, he came slowly back to the iron rail, leaning on it, breathing hard. His face was lined and shrunken. His hand clutched his heavy black staff like a claw. "I did not give you leave to go," said Gandalf sternly. "I have not finished. You have become a fool, Saruman, and yet pitiable. You might still have turned away from folly and evil, and have been of service, but you choose to stay and gnaw the ends of your old plots. Stay then, but I warn you, you will not easily come out again, not unless the dark hands of the east stretch out to take you." "Saruman," he cried, and his voice grew in power and authority. "Behold, I am not Gandalf the Grey, whom you betrayed. I am Gandalf the White, who has returned from death. You have no color now, and I cast you from the Order and from the Council." He raised his hand and spoke slowly in a clear, cold voice. "Saruman, your staff is broken." There was a crack, and the staff split asunder in Saruman's hand, and the head of it fell down at Gandalf's feet. "Go," said Gandalf. With a cry, Saruman fell back and crawled away. As you heard, there was a lot more going on here in the novel than there was in the film, with Saruman wavering at points and attempting to put on a fair guise in order to lull those before him into a false sense of security. It would be this encounter that spells the end of Saruman in the films, and afterwards in the novel, his flight from Orthanc, after which much was discovered about his crimes concerning his hoarding of many things of value within its walls. But King Elisar, when he was crowned in Gondor, began the reordering of his realm, and one of his first tasks was the restoration of Orthanc, where he proposed to set up again the Palantir recovered from Saruman. Then all the secrets of the tower were searched. Many things of worth were found, jewels and heirlooms of Errol, filched from Edoras by the agency of Wormtongue during King Theoden's decline, and other such things, more ancient and beautiful, from mounds and tombs far and wide. Saruman in his degradation had become not a dragon, but a jackdaw. At last, behind a hidden door that they could not have found or opened had not Elisar had the aid of Gimli the dwarf, a steel closet was revealed. Maybe it had been intended to receive the ring, but it was almost bare. In a casket on a high shelf, two things were laid. One was a small case of gold, attached to a fine chain. It was empty, and bore no letter or token, but beyond all doubt, it had once borne the ring about Isildur's neck. Next to it lay a treasure without price, long mourned as lost forever. The Elendilmere itself, the white star of elvish crystal upon a fillet of mithril that had descended from Silmarion to Elendil, and had been taken by him as the token of royalty in the North Kingdom. Every king and the chieftains that followed them in Arnor had borne the Elendilmere, down even to Elisar himself. But though it was a jewel of great beauty, made by elvensmiths in Imladris for Valandil, Isildur's son, it had not the ancientry nor potency of the one that had been lost when Isildur fled into the dark and came back no more. Elisar took it up with reverence, and when he returned to the north and took up again the full kingship of Arnor, Arwen bounded upon his brow, and men were silent and amazed to see its splendor. But Elisar did not again imperil it, and wore it only on high days in the North Kingdom. Otherwise, when in kingly raiment, he bore the Elendilmere, which had descended to him. "And this also is a thing of reverence," he said, "and above my worth, 40 heads have worn it before." When men considered this secret hoard more closely, they were dismayed, for it seemed to them that these things, and certainly the Elendilmere, could not have been found unless they had been upon Isildur's body when he sank. But if that had been in deep water of strong flow, they would in time have been swept far away. Therefore Isildur must have fallen not into the deep stream, but into shallow water, no more than shoulder high. Why then, though an age had passed, were there no traces of his bones? Had Saruman found them and scorned them, burned them with dishonor in one of his furnaces? If that were so, it was a shameful deed, but not his worst. Now, though Saruman met his end here in the films following his conversation with Gandalf and friends, this was far from the end of Saruman in the novel, though he's not seen again until much later following the fall of Sauron, while Gandalf and the hobbits were making their way west in the company of Celeborn and Galadriel. Soon the dwindling company, following the Isen, turned west and rode through the gap into the wastelands beyond, and then they turned northwards and passed over the borders of Dunland. The Dunlandings fled and hid themselves, for they were afraid of elvish folk, though few indeed ever came to their country. But the travelers did not heed them, for they were still a great company and were well provided with all that they needed, and they went on their way at their leisure, setting up their tents when they would. On the 6th day since their parting from the king, they journeyed through a wood climbing down from the hills at the feet of the misty mountains that now marched on their right hand. As they came out again into the open country at sundown, they overtook an old man leaning on a staff, and he was clothed in rags of gray or dirty white, and at his heels went another beggar, slouching and whining. "Well, Saruman," said Gandalf, "where are you going?" "What is that to you?" he answered. "Will you still order my goings, and are you not content with my ruin?" "You know the answers," said Gandalf. "No, and no, but in any case, the time of my labors now draws to an end. The king has taken on the burden. If you had waited at Orthanc, you would have seen him, and he would have shown you wisdom and mercy. Then all the more reason to have left sooner," said Saruman, "for I desire neither of him. Indeed, if you wish for an answer to your first question, I am seeking a way out of his realm." "Then once more you are going the wrong way," said Gandalf, "and I see no hope in your journey. But will you scorn our help, for we offer it to you?" "To me?" said Saruman. "Nay, pray do not smile at me. I prefer your frowns, and as for the lady here, I do not trust her. She always hated me and schemed for your part. I do not doubt that she has brought you this way to have the pleasure of gloating over my poverty. Had I been warned of your pursuit, I would have denied you the pleasure." "Saruman," said Galadriel, "we have other errands and other cares that seem to us more urgent than hunting for you. Say rather that you are overtaken by good fortune, for now you have a last chance. If it be truly the last, I am glad," said Saruman, "for I shall be spared the trouble of refusing it again. All my hopes are ruined, but I would not share yours, if you have any." For a moment his eyes kindled. "Go," he said. "I did not spend long study on these matters for naught. You have doomed yourselves, and you know it, and it will afford me some comfort as I wonder to think that you pulled down your own house when you destroyed mine. And now, what ship will bear you back across so wide a sea?" he mocked. "It will be a gray ship, and full of ghosts," he laughed, but his voice was cracked and hideous. "Get up, you idiot," he shouted to the other beggar, who had sat down on the ground, and he struck him with his staff. "Turn about. If these fine folk are going our way, then we will take another. Get on, or I'll give you no crust for your supper." The beggar turned and slouched past whimpering. "Poor old Grima, always beaten and cursed. How I hate him. I wish I could leave him." "Then leave him," said Gandalf. But Wormtongue only shot a glance of his bleared eyes full of terror at Gandalf, and then shuffled quickly past behind Saruman. As the wretched pair passed by the company, they came to the hobbits, and Saruman stopped and stared at them, but they looked at him with pity. "So you have come to gloat too, have you, my urchins?" he said. "You don't care what a beggar lacks, do you? For you have all you want, food and fine clothes, and the best weed for your pipes. Oh yes, I know where it comes from. You would not give a pipeful to a beggar, would you?" "I would if I had any," said Frodo. "You can have what I've got left," said Merry, "if you will wait a moment." He got down and searched in the bag at his saddle. Then he handed to Saruman a leather pouch. "Take what there is," he said. "You are welcome to it. It came from the flotsam of Isengard." "Mine, mine, yes, and dearly bought," cried Saruman, clutching at the pouch. "This is only a repayment and token, for you took more, I'll be bound. Still, a beggar must be grateful if a thief returns him even a morsel of his own. Well, it will serve you right when you come home, if you find things less good in the South Farthing than you would like. Long may your land be short of leaf." "Thank you," said Merry. "In that case, I will have my pouch back, which is not yours and has journeyed far with me. Wrap the weed in a rag of your own." "One thief deserves another," said Saruman, and turned his back on Merry, and kicked Wormtongue, and went away towards the wood. Filled with malice and cruelty, and forced to become a vagabond, Saruman in his defeat was as ungracious as he could be, and a nasty man full of resentment, and regretted that. But despite how far he'd been cast down, he was still a man of great intellect and cunning, and he was more than capable of harming the world further. This encounter occurred on the 28th of August of that year, and by September 22nd, Saruman had made his way to the Shire with Grima in tow, linking up with his ally Lotho Sackville Baggins, and setting himself up as a petty king of that realm. Carting in thugs and ruffians, Saruman proceeded to rule the Shire as a dictator, rationing all resources and claiming them as his own to build up for himself a new store of wealth that he presumably intended to use to regain some of his old strength and try again to bring himself the great power he would need to realize his dream of conquering all of Middle-earth. The Scouring of the Shire this event was called, and for 2 long months, Saruman under the name Sharky oppressed the hobbits until Frodo and his party returned to rally their brethren into overthrowing their new Dark Master. Before long, a battle was fought wherein many hobbits and men alike were slain, and when the dust had settled and Frodo and Sam went to confront Lotho, who they assumed responsible for this carnage, they found him dead, stabbed by Grima on the orders of Saruman, who appeared to gloat over the hobbits in this moment of revelation, a moment that would end up being his last. "This is worse than Mordor," said Sam. "Much worse in a way. It comes home to you, as they say, because it is home, and you remember it before it was all ruined." "Yes, this is Mordor," said Frodo. "Just one of its works. Saruman was doing its work all the time, even when he thought he was working for himself, and the same with those that Saruman tricked, like Lotho." Merry looked round in dismay and disgust. "Let's get out," he said. "If I had known all the mischief he had caused, I should have stuffed my pouch down Saruman's throat." "No doubt, but you did not, and so I am able to welcome you home." There standing at the door was Saruman himself, looking well fed and well pleased, His eyes gleamed with malice and amusement. A sudden light broke on Frodo. "Sharky!" he cried. Saruman laughed. "So you have heard the name, have you? All my people used to call me that in Isengard, I believe. A sign of affection, possibly. But evidently you did not expect to see me here." "I did not," said Frodo, "but I might have guessed. A little mischief in a mean way. Gandalf warned me that you were still capable of it." "Quite capable," said Saruman, "and more than a little. You made me laugh, you hobbit lordlings, riding along with all those great people, so secure and so pleased with your little selves. You thought you had done very well out of it all, and could now just amble back and have a nice quiet time in the country. Saruman's home could be all wrecked, and he could be turned out, but no one could touch yours. Oh no, Gandalf would look after your affairs." Saruman laughed again. "Not he. When his tools have done their tasks, he drops them. But you must go dangling after him, and riding round twice as far as you needed. Well, thought I, if they're such fools, I will get ahead of them and teach them a lesson. One ill turn deserves another. It would have been a sharper lesson if only you had given me a little more time and more men. Still, I have already done much that you will find it hard to mend or undo in your lives, and it will be pleasant to think of that and set it against my injuries." "Well, if that is what you find pleasure in," said Frodo, "I pity you. It will be a pleasure of memory only, I fear. Go at once, and never return. I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him, in the hope that he may find it." Saruman rose to his feet and stared at Frodo. There was a strange look in his eyes of mingled wonder and respect and hatred. "You have grown, halfling," he said. "Yes, you have grown very much. You are wise and cruel. You have robbed my revenge of sweetness, and now I must go hence in bitterness, in debt to your mercy. I hate it, and you. Well, I go, and I will trouble you no more. But do not expect me to wish you health and long life. You will have neither, but that is not my doing. I merely foretell." He walked away, and the hobbits made a lane for him to pass, but their knuckles whitened as they gripped on their weapons. Wormtongue hesitated, and then followed his master. "Wormtongue," called Frodo, "you need not follow him. I know of no evil you have done to me. You can have rest and food here for a while, until you are stronger and can go your own ways." Wormtongue halted and looked back at him, half prepared to stay. Saruman turned. "No evil," he cackled. "Oh no, even when he sneaks out at night, it is only to look at the stars. But did I hear someone ask where poor Lotho is hiding? You know, don't you, Worm? Will you tell them?" Wormtongue cowered down and whimpered. "No, no." "Then I will," said Saruman. "Worm killed your chief. Poor little fellow. Your nice little boss. Didn't you, Worm? Stabbed him in his sleep, I believe. Buried him, I hope. Though Worm has been very hungry lately. No, Worm is not really nice. You had better leave him to me." A look of wild hatred came into Wormtongue's red eyes. "You told me to. You made me do it," he hissed. Saruman laughed. "You do what Sharky says, always, don't you, Worm? Well, now he says, follow." He kicked Wormtongue in the face as he groveled, and turned and made off. But at that something snapped. Suddenly, Wormtongue rose up, drawing a hidden knife, and then with a snarl like a dog, he sprang on Saruman's back, jerked his head back, cut his throat, and with a yell ran off down the lane. Before Frodo could recover or speak a word, 3 hobbit bows twanged, and Wormtongue fell dead. So ended the life of Saruman, and the last man truly aligned with him, fittingly killed by his own lieutenant, as he once aimed to kill the entity that he had become in many ways a lieutenant to. But, as is the fate for all who call this plane home, that was not the end of his spirit. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale shrouded figure, it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh, dissolved into nothing. Frodo looked down at the body with pity and horror, for as he looked, it seemed that long years of death were suddenly revealed in it, and it shrank, and the shriveled face became rags of skin upon a hideous skull. Lifting up the skirt of the dirty cloak that sprawled beside it, he covered it over and turned away. And that was the true end of Saruman, the Maya of such power and respect that he was once considered even more magnificent in stature than even Gandalf was, but a man who, in the end, became little more than a shadow of the misery and evil that he once spread across the land. The degradation of his body in his final moments displays for us perfectly what harm all that Saruman had endeavored to do had wrought upon his body and soul, with all the evil he attempted to embody, reducing him to a frightening husk of misery and terror, who thereafter became not but a wisp of smoke to be blown away and forgotten. Over the course of his long and storied existence, Saruman was many things. He was a master of craft and a wise sage filled with nearly bottomless knowledge, but most of all, he was a villain. A being who could not control his lust for power and the jealousy and envy for those he, or others, perceived as being greater than he was. Saruman once chastised Gandalf for seeming to desire the crowns of kings and all the staves of the 5 wizards for himself, but in truth, that was what Saruman desired, and he showed it plainly on his person, with his words and with his actions, the man who made for himself a cloak of many colors to imitate the powers of his contemporaries, and a ring of his own, so he too might rise to the heights of power as once did his long-lost brother, rival, and master. When examining all that Saruman did, we find within him a lesser echo of Sauron, one who never even achieved a fraction of his power, who was as much a petulant child screaming for more as much as he was a divine being. But in both of these characters, we find lesser representations of the first and truest evil of the Tolkien legendarium, Morgoth Bauglir, the black enemy of all life in this universe. For just as Morgoth, the devil of Middle-earth, so envied the power of God that he strove not to replicate him, but supplant and usurp him, so too did Sauron desire much the same in service to him, and Saruman in turn, when faced with the opportunity to follow in their footsteps. As terrifyingly evil as both Morgoth and Sauron were, in a way, the evil of Saruman, though lesser, is equal to, or even exceeds theirs. For unlike Morgoth and Sauron, who turned to evil from nearly the outset of their existence, Saruman was long a scion of good, so much so that he was chosen as an ideal candidate to stamp out evil. So instead of thousands upon thousands of lives being saved due to his efforts, instead, thousands upon thousands of lives were ended. Men, women, and children of all different species succumbed to the machinations of Saruman the Great and Terrible, and so too did all the lands that felt the cruel touch of his white hand. An entity who, envious of the power and respect of others, and subject to the follies of man, turned away from his noble charge and played a mighty hand in nearly ensuring that this world would forevermore be drowned in evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Saruman? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord channel members, Elijah Kai VA, Mr. Awesome, Louis Dockstater, Just Keeping It Real, Lachlan, Atris Rain, Seltsopa, Him Downstairs, and Off Mega, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.